Chapter 22. Habit and Change. The whole goth scene bores me to tears, I told him. I didn't feel like saying any more. My black lipstick added the appropriate irony. Creating the look had been a real triumph, but that was years ago. I maintained it more out of habit than anything else. It had become my uniform. Sometimes I think I'll wear my black clothes, combat boots, and corsets right into old age. Sometimes I think I'll chuck it tomorrow. The boredom I referred to stemmed from the fact that, to many, these aren't just clothes. They are an ideology, an attitude, urban paganism, second-rate Satan worship, and all that crap. This discussion began one afternoon when Joaquin stopped what he was doing, looked at me, moonstruck, and tried to rationalize why he liked my style so much. He told me the significance he drew from each article of clothing, its Victorian heritage, and its sadomasochistic connotations. He expounded on the contrast between the soft, feminine lace and the hard, military accessories, the sensual warmth and the cold, mortuary appearance, the pleated Catholic schoolgirl miniskirts and the inverted crucifixes. His eye for detail impressed me. I was interested in the social history of the Darksider wardrobe, too, but I'd heard it all 1,000 times before, so I stopped him. You like it because it makes me look hot. I felt a little guilty about it, but I had to set certain boundaries, and I decided to start then and there. Our relationship was about to spread beyond intimacy and private space, making us into media celebrities, and I needed to establish strict rules about the way we portrayed ourselves through our microphones. Joaquin didn't have a problem with that. He developed an alter ego who was sometimes maniacal but sometimes restrained, who could listen patiently and didn't treat every public appearance as an opportunity to show off. But I was more interested in ensuring we wouldn't turn the program into a farce, a grotesque vaudeville show starring us as one of those monstrous couples who put themselves on display. I couldn't shake the image of Jim and Tammy Baker, but when I mentioned this to Joaquin, he just laughed and said, "I think secretly you want to be Tammy Faye." I know I was exaggerating. Maybe I was even being a little hysterical, but anyone who values their independence feels threatened when they embark on someone else's project. It's a basic survival instinct. I agreed to be on Ghost Radio because I thought it would give me material to work with once I got back to the university. Plus, it might be fun. But if my guard went down, I was lost. As a matter of fact, it was fun. For me, sessions on the air were like living Star Trek episodes. We listened to stories in isolation from the world. We commented on them. We argued to the point of shouting. Most of the stories were really about loneliness, primal fear, maternal abandonment, Electra complexes, sexual frustration, spiritual suffering. You didn't have to be a genius to figure out that these were the things our callers were really afraid of. It didn't matter whether we imagined them as transparent specters, chupacabras, mummies, tentacled monsters, or any other malformed creature. In essence, all these beings were reflections of everyday fears and traumas. Discovering this, which was obvious to so many, was a revelation. Joaquin understood where I was coming from, but didn't always agree. "Sometimes a ghost is just a ghost," he'd say. Perhaps he needed that attitude to make the show work. You can't be psychoanalyzing all your callers and still create entertaining radio. And Joaquin created entertaining radio. I loved watching the different emotions he went through, from enthusiastic to arrogant to bemused to excited. Occasionally, he went into a trance-like state. Those episodes made me nervous. At first, I was convinced it was theatrics, that he was putting on an act to impress me. But I soon realized that it wasn't that at all. He was truly entering an altered state, and when he did so, he was oblivious to the world around him. I eventually got used to his sporadic trips into the world of unexplained phenomena. He was able to wade through the mist covering the borderland between the normal and the paranormal. Although it scared me a little, part of me admired it. But I had concluded it was just one of those things better left alone. I chose to ignore it, but that wasn't always possible. In time, Ghost Radio became my home, a space where I felt comfortable, where I could express myself without fear. Our little program was a tunnel, a highway of voices. Sometimes I was behind the wheel, sometimes simply a passenger. I'd earned my slot on the program. I got along well with the staff and participated in the decision-making process. That was already several times better than the relationship I had with my fellow professors at the university, with whom anything more personal than an exchange of good afternoons was unthinkable. As always in my life, I assumed from the beginning that this was just a passing phase, that at some rapidly approaching moment everything would change. I couldn't imagine any other outcome, even though, unlike practically every earlier stage of my life, I was really satisfied. I didn't feel like going through another change, lugging my suitcases somewhere else, saying goodbye to people, and filling garbage bags with the things I couldn't take with me. One afternoon, I was having coffee at Joaquin's apartment, which was now my apartment too, and thinking about this, when I looked out the window and saw a couple fighting in the park. He was trying to hug her, but she pushed him, gently at first, and then with more force. He gestured emphatically, trying to make her stay. She didn't seem convinced and walked off, but he ran after her and stopped her. Once again he waved his hands around, speaking in a voice that, although I couldn't hear through the closed window, was obviously growing louder and louder. I could almost hear him through the closed window. I didn't want to eavesdrop, though. I didn't want to know what he was saying to keep her from leaving him. He didn't seem to care that passers-by were watching. Shame and discretion had vanished. There was only his desperate attempt to conquer this woman. She dug in harder, looking at the ground, not like someone who's embarrassed, but sternly refusing all contact. She raised her hands to keep him from even touching her. Finally, she turned and walked away. He watched her, his shoulders drooping. Their separation affected me in a way I had difficulty understanding. I couldn't stop thinking about them, about his enormous sadness and her detachment. I walked through the apartment, appreciating it more than ever, its wide windows that let the sunlight in, its wooden floors, its kitchen and cozy bedroom. It was going to be hard work leaving this place. It was going to be even more difficult to peel myself away from Joaquin. When he returned the next morning, the first thing he said to me was, "How'd you like a change of scenery?" It seems he had a chance to test ghost radio in the United States, possibly leading to a syndication deal. The notion of going back to the United States didn't seem very attractive at that point, but it wasn't something I completely ruled out either. I figured I'd have to return eventually, but going back now felt like cutting off something vital, sacrificing important experiences, abandoning ideas and projects. Above all, leaving Mexico made me think of my mother, who'd followed my father to America and was never happy there. Was this history repeating itself? Fate, genetics, emotional programming? "You're going to have to go alone." "I'm staying," I told him. I didn't get emotional. I didn't know if I was right. I had to take this position, but I also had to hear his arguments. We spent weeks debating the advantages and disadvantages of moving. It was a major opportunity for Joaquin, and it made me feel guilty to think of him sacrificing something so big. He was in the same situation. He didn't want to leave me, but he didn't want to pressure me to go. It seemed that no matter what, we both came out losers. Joaquin spoke of the violence, the kidnapping, the misery, and the pollution in Mexico. "And you really want to live in a country at war, where you're an ethnic minority? You want your program to target the marginalized and dispossessed?" I asked him. "Don't go all intellectual on me. I'm stating facts, but avoiding the real one." I stared at him, trying to diminish the anger in my eyes. "What are you afraid of, Alondra?" I was about to challenge him, but I knew he was right. I was afraid. But why? And of what? I shook my head slowly and looked at the floor. Nothing was resolved. The discussions continued. Joaquin became more convincing, and I faltered. I conceded certain points, but held fast on others. He hadn't won yet, but a tiny voice inside me told me he would, eventually. Adding to the mosaic of issues that came with a return to the United States, Joaquin was counting on me to form part of the Ghost Radio team. I didn't find out until later, but the corporation buying the program did not want the format changed, and my presence was fundamental because I was American. I was the link between both cultures. Joaquin didn't dare tell me that they were pretty much buying me. He was afraid, and rightly so, that this would be too much pressure. At any rate, he said, they want the entire team. They want to reproduce the program's formula exactly. Well, I guess you and Watt will have to find someone else. I asked Joaquin not to talk about it for a few days. I wasn't interested in hearing any more about moves, changes, or cultural transplantation. I needed to weigh the pros and cons myself. I needed time to think. Chapter 23. The Contract. I sold my soul to the devil. That old cliché never felt more apt. I won't go into detail. When you're talking about business, the minutiae of contracts, unions, safety, and benefits bore me to tears. After all, it all boils down to one question: how much? I know it might sound mercenary, even flat-out selfish, but what can I say? For the first time in my life, someone had managed to stir my ambition. It began, like so many other things, with an email. The message was signed by a guy named Dan Foster and sent from an address at Intermedia Enterprises. I answered courteously, as I always do. Dan kept sending me messages for a few weeks, like he was just another fan, commenting on the program and giving his opinion on my hosting. Then one day he traveled to Mexico to see me and tossed out his proposal. He didn't waste time. He offered me a nationally syndicated program, a fabulous salary, an apartment, and a car. But Dan Foster, who it turned out was president and CEO of the media conglomerate, presented all this as if it were a mission, an unprecedented adventure in social upheaval. We're going to break barriers in every sense of the term, not only because they'll be able to listen to you across the United States of America on the radio and around the world on the internet, but because on top of crossing over into the afterlife, you're also going to be crossing linguistic and cultural barriers that no one's ever been able to penetrate. Can you imagine what this will mean to the Hispanic community? I could imagine and nodded my head, but it all seemed abstract to me. Besides, I wasn't interested in being a pioneer in my field. My life wasn't what you would call chaotic, but I considered it well-stocked. The way Foster was talking, this program was going to turn me into the general of a Hispanic broadcast revolution. I told him this. You're going to pave the way for your countrymen. To be honest, I didn't get into radio to change the world. You're gonna be a hero. I won't deny having ridiculous delusions, but becoming a hero wasn't one of them, and certainly not from a broadcasting booth. Dan, it's a little program about ghosts and horror stories. We're not writing declarations of independence here. I know, but believe me, it'll be revolutionary anyways. It didn't make sense to argue. To him, a Mexican hosting a successful radio program was groundbreaking. To me, it didn't seem any more relevant than the fact that there were Mexican actors and directors like Salma Hayek, Guillermo del Toro, and Alejandro González Iñárritu in Hollywood. Apparently, to him, this was not only more important but more subversive. Next, we talked about money. I didn't go into radio for the money. What I earned allowed me to live well, but the Intermedia offer was very impressive. We're talking serious cash. He did say I'd have to go through a test period, but suggested with their promotional backing, I'd pass through that with flying colors. I wasn't so sure. I originally developed an interest in radio after I accepted that I'd finally reached the inevitable age where I was too old for rock and roll and too young to die. I played with lots of bands and recorded hundreds of tracks after the disillusion of Death Muertos. but I was never satisfied with the results. I had never been able to recapture the kind of sound I'd had with Gabriel. None of what I'd done afterwards seemed like it was up to the standards of our music. And Gabriel wasn't there. Without him, making music felt like work. For me, radio was a space for reflection. On the air, I submerged myself in music and literature. I listened along with my audience. I read to myself and to them. I discussed all kinds of ideas with total strangers. It was the perfect medium, intense, warm, interactive, and highly volatile. From my very first session in the broadcast studio, I felt like I was in a time capsule, a sensory deprivation chamber. It was a protective bubble where nothing and no one could touch me. The semi-darkness, the illuminated panel, and the on-air light combined to create a cozy, womb-like environment, a sort of cosmic solitude. I had the sensation of floating in space, completely isolated from the real world. My only human contact was the disembodied voices of callers. Everything seemed dusted with an ethereal, yes, I'll say it, ghostly quality. I could touch and hear the whole world, while no one could be sure of my existence. I was just one more voice in the teeming concert of Hertzian waves. It was a land of the blind, where we were guided by sounds and voices, and space took the shape our words gave it. We transformed it with every description, comment, insult, or digression. It was almost like death, floating aimlessly at night, listening to spectral voices that in turn spoke about specters, indifferent to their own condition. One day, I read a fragment from Edgar Allan Poe on the air, The Telltale Heart. My audience responded well. The calls poured in. Some, who already knew the story, praised me for elevating the abysmal level of discourse on that pigsty you call a program. Others, younger or more ignorant, wanted to know more about Poe. Did he teach at a local university or sign autographs at shopping malls? The surprising thing was that a few, inspired by my reading, started calling in with anecdotes, stories that seemed to them mysterious or inexplicable. Hello, my name is Manuel. I work as a security guard at a building downtown that's under construction. I couldn't resist the temptation to call because I really liked what you read. I already wrote down the author. I'm going to buy the book. But what I really wanted to tell you is something that happened to me. I'm 42 years old, and about 20 years ago I worked in construction, as a builder. Anyways, one night I was working overtime with my uncle at a site. I had to push wheelbarrows full of mixed cement up to the third floor on top of some wooden planks. One night my uncle, who got me the job, showed me a bottle of tequila. How about it, nephew? Want some? It'll warm you up. I said no, it was a bad idea. I could get into trouble or even fall. He said, don't worry, just take it easy. We aren't getting drunk, we're getting warm. Back then I drank. Not anymore. The last time I had one was about 5 years ago, and I don't intend to fall off the wagon. But back then I thought my uncle might be right. Besides, he was almost as important as the foreman, so I figured nothing would happen. I took a drink and started up with a load. When I got back down, I walked past my uncle again. He told me to take another shot, and I did. By the 5th round, I was real tipsy, singing and talking shit, and then I fell. I fell into the wheelbarrow, rolled a few yards, and then dropped about 6 feet. I was covered in liquid concrete. Everything hurt. I thought I'd never be able to move again. Then I heard my uncle's booming laugh. His guffaws echoed on the naked walls of the construction site. He finally stopped laughing and came down to see if I was still alive. He wiped the cement off of me and helped me up. What a fucking idiot you turned out to be, nephew, he said over and over again. I'd had enough and I was really hurting, so I told him a few times to knock it off, but he'd have none of it. He thought it was the funniest thing in the world, me falling like that. He kept making fun of me as we climbed out, but then he slipped, hit his head, and landed in the same place where I'd fallen. I limped down there to take a look. He wasn't moving. His eyes were open, but it looked like he wasn't breathing. How about that, motherfucker? Who's got the last laugh now? I shouted at the old bastard. I was so angry I threw the wheelbarrow down after him. But it wasn't long before I sobered up and realized that this was serious business and I could end up in jail. I brought more cement and poured it over my uncle. By the second full wheelbarrow, though, he started moving. Terrified, I ran for another full wheelbarrow and threw it on him, and I carefully smoothed it over. By the next morning, the cement was dry, and the floor looked pretty good, maybe a little higher than it was supposed to be. Luckily, it was hardly noticeable. When the architect arrived that day, he asked me why we'd poured that floor already. I got nervous. I said my uncle had told me that it had to be done so they could put in the stairway. He looked at me curiously and asked how my uncle was doing. I don't know. Last night he went home by himself, I answered. When you see him, tell him to please come and see me. What, the floor isn't good enough? I asked him. It's fine, but I need him to hurry up with the stairs. No one ever saw my uncle again. Some thought he'd run off with a woman. His wife couldn't understand it because he'd never been a Don Juan and he always checked in. After some months, she accepted that he'd either gone up north or been killed during a mugging. I continued working at the site. One night, I woke up tasting blood and tequila. I washed up my mouth several times, but it wouldn't go away. On the contrary, every time I passed the place where my uncle was buried, the taste grew stronger. Sometimes I thought it was going to choke me. Sometimes it even made me throw up. I went to see several doctors, even a healer. No one found anything. I chewed mints all day long, I ate raw onions and garlic, but the tang of blood covered everything. I became desperate. I had all my teeth extracted, thinking that would cure me. Nothing. It pursued me long after we finished that building. The people living there now would never imagine that they walk over my uncle every time they climb the stairs. Yesterday, in fact, I almost went over there to yell to the whole world that my dead uncle is buried in the cement down below. My nerve failed me, but when I heard that story just now, I knew it was a sign. Finally, I must confess. Well, thanks for sharing your story on the air, although I don't really know how to handle a case like this. Are you going to turn yourself into the police? No. Why should I? You murdered your uncle. I didn't murder anybody. He fell by accident. Well, you covered him with cement. He wasn't dead at the time. I know, but the cement killed him. How do I know you're not pulling my leg? That's your problem, said the man. I imagined the taste of tequila and blood in his mouth as he hung up. This definitely wasn't the kind of response I'd expected from the public when I decided to read Poe on the air. I never thought it would turn my audience into radio witnesses to a crime. But while we're researching that, keep those calls coming, I said. The calls didn't stop. At first we only got a few each night, but it quickly became a deluge. Thousands of people wanted to talk about their experience or put in their 2 cents about the stories of other callers. Soon I couldn't keep up with all the calls pouring in. This piqued the interest of the radio station. First, they assigned me a permanent sound engineer. Up to that point, I'd worked with whoever was on the clock. And then they started adding assistants to take calls and attend to the growing needs of the program. Most remarkable of all, I gained the respect of my colleagues and bosses. My placid oasis of calm, the pitch-black ocean of tranquility where I had floated aimlessly, became a frenetic anthill of activity. There were still dead hours and slow days, but Ghost Radio, as we started calling the program, consistently registered the best ratings in both its genre and its time slot. Calls flooded in from across the nation and other parts of the world. Latinos residing in the United States bombarded me night after night with their stories. But soon they were also calling in from as far away as Australia and Namibia. My bosses were happy, and so was I. I wouldn't have changed a thing, but change came anyway, with a vengeance. Chapter 24. A Peculiar Exchange. The new show with Intermedia was certainly different from those early days. The office was nicer, the coffee was better, and the paycheck substantially larger. But one thing was the same: the callers. They were the same mix of bizarre, sincere, and ridiculous. Joaquin liked this mixture. His fears about being in America slowly disappeared, but they would return one night when a peculiar caller lit up line 2. "We're here with a caller who won't give his name," said Joaquin, pushing the button for line 2. "Go ahead, anonymous friend. You're on the air." The silence seemed endless. Usually in situations like this, Joaquin would jump in, yelling, "Caller, are you there?" If the caller didn't respond instantly, he'd be cut off. This time, though, Joaquin sat quietly. He didn't rush the caller and didn't check to see if the line was still active. "Dead air," hissed Watt. Joaquin didn't respond. Alondra opened her mouth to say something. Joaquin signaled her to wait. Silence. The seconds passed. Tick, tick, tick. A raspy voice resonated through the speakers. "Joaquin, I'm glad we can speak to each other again." "Speak again?" "We're old friends." "I usually recognize my friends." "I saw death." "Tell us what happened." "Just what I told you. I saw death. Nothing happened to me. I wasn't pulled from death's grip. I didn't lose my will to live. I simply saw death's face, its poisonous snout squealing a few inches from my own." "Like Alien 3? "No, nothing like that." "The first Alien film?" Joaquin said, suppressing a laugh. "You've seen him too, Joaquin. He remembers you." Joaquin was intrigued. "And how do you explain this apparition?" asked Alondra. "Let's just say at this point I wouldn't consider it to be a solitary apparition, but rather a recurring event." "So you see death often?" asked Joaquin. "Often." Joaquin felt the chill run down his spine. This call was making him very uncomfortable. It wasn't the usual. It demanded attention. He looked at Watt, who had stopped eating and was motionless, staring at the monitor, like a cat thinking it's heard a mouse. "I am something special, unlike anyone you've ever talked to before. I am Ghost Radio's beginning and end. It's Alpha and Omega. I am a transformed and transfigured being, waiting for you in the night." Joaquin's arms felt numb. He wanted to stretch or maybe stand up, but he could barely move. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed a change in the shadow that the table cast on the wall. It looked different, as if it were illuminated by another source of light. For a moment, it seemed to transform into a tombstone. He blinked, and it was the table again. But now he was aware of the shadows playing tricks with his peripheral vision. Before his eyes, matter transformed into shadow and shadow into matter. Meanwhile, the anonymous caller continued. "It's a privilege to be in this position, between life and death, heaven and hell." "Purgatory," said Alondra. "No, sweetheart, that's a bedtime story for religious freaks. From where I am, I can make phone calls, watch TV, eat junk food." "Some would say that's the best of both worlds," remarked Alondra. "And the worst, of course," added the voice. Joaquin saw a cadaverous face, flesh hanging from bone, muscles exposed. He winced. "Try to imagine an animal is eating you alive, chewing on your head. You're conscious. You feel its fangs dig into your scalp. Feel strips of flesh pulled from your skull. For the past 10 years, I've lived with that sensation." Joaquin was startled. His palms were sweaty. He glanced around, half expecting to find somebody watching him. "Now, are you interested in listening to me, Joaquin?" asked the caller. "Completely," he answered. "But I think you're lying. Just think what it would feel like to burn in an ocean of fire forever, to be cooked alive for eternity, suffering every instant as if it were the first moment you felt the flames touch your skin, without the slightest possibility of growing accustomed to the pain." Before the voice had finished speaking, Joaquin saw the shadows in the studio become a window looking out on an infernal landscape, one worthy of a famous illustration by Gustave Doré, for the divine comedy that had given him childhood nightmares. He couldn't understand what was happening. Blinking nervously, he looked around trying to gauge whether he was the only one tormented by these images. A sense of anguish overwhelmed him. He had never seen or felt anything like this. It was true that after his parents' deaths, extremely vivid nightmares had caused him years of sleepless nights, but he had overcome these long ago. One day he decided that he wouldn't be afraid again, that he wouldn't allow it, that instead he would respond coldly to everything. The worst thing that could happen to him already had, and so he unshouldered his emotional burden. At that moment, however, flanked by his girlfriend Alondra and his friend Watt, the old fear returned. "Did you hear my question?" Joaquin asked, trying to regain his composure. "What do you think I'm lying about?" "I don't think you can watch TV. I don't think you can eat junk food. I think you're lucky to even make this call." The caller was silent, but this time Watt didn't warn Joaquin about dead air. Finally, the caller spoke. "What do you think of this fairy tale? Once upon a time, there was a young man, barely past childhood, who lived in a perfect world of privilege, a world where his sexual awakening was experienced with the most beautiful girls, where he only needed to wish for something and it would come true, and where everything indicated that his talent and intellect would take him to the top of whatever mountain he chose to climb. Then his universe fell apart. He was left abandoned and alone in a world of shadows and danger, at the mercy of criminals and depraved minds. The young man, no longer a child, was transformed into a swan, saving him from that bleak world." "A swan, huh? Like in Anderson's story, The Wild Swans?" Joaquin recollected it vaguely. "Exactly." "Why don't you just cut off this asshole?" whispered Alondra in his ear. She was covering the microphone, but it was obvious she would have preferred to scream it out on the air. Joaquin shook his head. For our listeners who don't know it, this is yet another children's tale, so of course it's macabre, sadistic, and sordid, as it should be. In this one, the king's 11 impeccable and well-behaved sons were the victims of their evil stepmother's jealousy. She forced the king to expel them from the palace. "It was through some strange magic that they were transformed into swans," explained Joaquin. "That's right. The swan is a symbol of the ethereal state of salvation. What appears to be a horrible punishment is, in fact, redemption. At night, the swans once again took on human form. In the end, their only sister made the sacrifice of sewing linen night shirts for them, woven from nettles taken from a cemetery. When the swans were draped with these nightshirts, the spell was broken and her brothers were set free. I don't care what it is, I find this story sinister, a sad tale of injustice with an absurd moral." Watt and Alondra were making frantic signals, drawing their index fingers across their necks as if slashing their throats. Alondra slipped him a piece of paper. "You have to cut him off now." Joaquin again gestured for them to leave him alone. "Well, my friend Joaquin, since you're having some sort of rebellion among your staff, I'm going to let you go for now. But before I leave, let me just say this. Joaquin, we'll talk soon. Best wishes." And then everything fell silent. Once again, they had dead air. Joaquin shivered just as he had that night, months earlier, when he received the same message flashed in Morse code by a helicopter. But strangely, he also tripped back to another night. A night of destiny. Chapter 25. A Night at the Station. A massive electrical storm was brewing. The sky turned from gray to mustard yellow, and the smell of ozone filled the air. Joaquin knew the plan was hasty and premature, but he couldn't turn back. Gabriel wouldn't let him. He didn't even want to, because he'd never seen Gabriel so excited about one of their projects. Death Muertos Live from Radio Mexico was the makeshift title they had given the concert, performance, and media intervention. They'd crossed the border like illegal aliens in reverse, from the United States into Mexico, the notion being that the trip itself was part of the show. Everything had to be a transgression. They carried a few instruments, and bags filled with the paraphernalia they planned to use during their jam session. On the Mexican side, 3 fans awaited them: Colette, Feliciano, and Martin, who had faithfully followed their music over the past year. They originally proposed the concert and offered to help with logistics. Gabriel took Polaroids along the way, new pages for his visual diary. Each flash reminded Joaquin of the night before. a raid on a convenience store, sliding packs of Polaroid film into his oversized coat, Gabriel played lookout. The border crossing was no big deal, other than the intermittent rain. According to the plan, they rendezvoused with Colette, Feliciano, and Martin at a gas station along the highway. The rain had stopped, but the blacktop was slick and water collected in the potholes. Martin sat in the driver's seat of an old Volkswagen van. Feliciano paced in front, and Colette leaned seductively on the hood, her dyed black hair still damp from the recent rain. They greeted Joaquin and Gabriel warmly, but Joaquin sensed a reticence in Colette. Behind her smiling eyes lurked a wariness that he found alluring. A few months ago, Colette and her friends helped set up an illegal feed of an Armenian punk concert broadcast from a jail in Ankara. Martin worked at the university-owned radio station, but its employees had gone on strike 2 years before, and the conflict was still unresolved. Gabriel and Joaquin had given him the impression that they knew how to operate the station's equipment. In reality, they didn't have a clue. Martin told them what to expect once they got in. "The station's operational, but it's been abandoned for some time," he said, showing them a diagram that explained how to broadcast a signal. He gave them some more drawings of electric circuits, pointing out that all of it ought to be ready to go. "You shouldn't have any trouble getting the ball rolling." He'd originally said he would come along, but there had been a change of plans. It would be better, he said now, if he kept an eye on the guards at the gate and picked the others up when they were done. Feliciano expressed concern. They hadn't had enough time to prepare. It was going to be risky and complicated to air the concert that night. "It'd really suck if we didn't do this because we're afraid. We've been working the grapevine for 2 weeks, letting everyone know the jam session's tonight. So it's gonna be tonight," said Gabriel, who was taking Polaroids of everyone. "And besides, nothing seems more perfect than playing on a night like this." Joaquin didn't say much. He couldn't keep his eyes off Colette. He lost himself in her dark, bitter eyes and juicy lips. She spoke with a strange accent. There was something familiar about her that he couldn't quite place. Although she smiled provocatively at him from time to time, on the whole she seemed somewhat detached. They decided to go for tacos and wrap up any unfinished business. Over dinner, Gabriel explained that taking over the station would be a great leap forward in their career. They'd burn CDs of the concert and package them with a booklet of all his Polaroids. "We want stations taken over everywhere. A full-scale rebellion, giving radio back to the people, away from the corporate suits and their bean-counting, top 40 shit." Joaquin agreed with the concept, but he was surprised to hear Gabriel trying to talk like a militant. It sounded artificial. He realized that much of it was aimed at Colette. This was flirting, Gabriel style. After finishing their tacos, Feliciano, Martin, and Colette went over their part of the plan. Feliciano would drive them to the station where they'd scale the outer fence. Martin would take care of security, and Colette, who knew the station well, would accompany them inside and act as their engineer. "You know how to use a soundboard and all that?" Joaquin asked her. "Yeah. I worked at a station in Boston for a summer. I learned a few things," she said as she brushed her hair from her face with the back of her hand. Joaquin vowed not to leave Mexico until he got to know her more intimately. "That'll do. It's going to be perfect," Gabriel said, taking another photo of her. Yep, Gabriel liked her too, he was certain. If Joaquin wanted to nip in ahead of him, he'd have to act fast. Near the end of their meal, a drunk approached them selling flowers. "For the little lady," he said with a drunken grin. Gabriel took one, tossing him $1. His eyes never left Colette. In Aztec society, flowers were an offering reserved for goddesses, Gabriel said, handing her the flower. Joaquin rolled his eyes. Colette wasn't impressed. She questioned the accuracy of Gabriel's statement. Aztecs offered flowers to their goddesses? I don't think so. An argument ensued. Gabriel was a good debater, but Colette parried every thrust. She knew her stuff, and Gabriel's bluffs withered. During this exchange, Joaquin sketched a rose on a napkin. He paid careful attention to the stem. Halfway down, it morphed into electric cable, ending in a 2-pronged plug. He offered the finished drawing to Colette. In modern society, drawings of flowers are given by broke guys trying to impress super hot girls, Joaquin said, mocking Gabriel's tone. That's a fact I can't dispute, Colette said, taking the drawing. She studied it, furrowing her brow. Joaquin thought it made her even cuter. Very cool. Would make a nice tat, she said, offering the highest of goth compliments. She folded the napkin and slid it into the back pocket of her alluringly tight jeans. They left the restaurant. Gabriel's rose lay forgotten on the table. Round 1 to Joaquin. They split up as planned. There was so much electricity loose in the desert that Joaquin's hair stuck to the van's interior. They got out of the VW. There wasn't anyone guarding the station. Joaquin jumped the fence first. Colette followed, leaping like a dancer in combat boots. Gabriel went over last. They heard barking. Martin said there weren't any dogs, Joaquin said. That's because there aren't any, replied Colette. Something's coming this way, and it's barking, Gabriel said. Okay, maybe there are dogs, Colette said. As she spoke, 2 enormous mastiffs leaped out from around a corner, barking and drooling. The group took off running. Joaquin felt an odd sense of joy in this moment. Gabriel sprinting ahead of him, the sound of combat boots on gravel behind him, and the growl of dogs farther back. This felt like life. Real, immediate, powerful. Gabriel reached a ladder set in the wall. He grabbed the bottom rung and scampered up. Joaquin let Colette go next, then sped off in the other direction, pursued by the dogs. He ran toward a brick wall at the back of the building, calculating on the fly that he could probably reach the top. When he jumped, though, his backpack shifted. He lost his balance, slipped, and hit his head against the wall. One of the dogs pounced on him, biting his head near the ear, then released him and backed away. Joaquin raised his head, disoriented, in pain and terrified. The mastiff's jaws hovered inches from his nose. A low growl emerged from deep in the beast's throat. Joaquin froze. He tried to think of a way out, but any movement would only provoke the dog further. This time he was sure his face would be the target. He was completely vulnerable, his life hanging on the instincts and the caprices of an animal. It's great to be alive, he thought strangely. Then, looking at the dog, at his slavering jaws and into his cold eyes, he had an idea. It was so absurd it just might work. "Home," he said in a commanding tone. The dog cocked its head as if it were listening. Its growls changed frequency. "Home," he repeated sternly. It slowly retreated, closed its jaws, and trotted off. Joaquin smiled and stood, the adrenaline mitigating the pain of his wounds. He returned to the ladder where Colette and Gabriel still clung. "What happened?" "The dogs are gone," he said. Colette jumped down and gave a start when she saw Joaquin's wounds. She gently caressed his face. "The dog? He tried to kiss me and missed." Colette chuckled and then shifted gears. "I don't think we have any choice but to stop now. Just look at the poor guy," she said to Gabriel. "It's just a scratch. Joaquin's very resilient. One little bite isn't going to hold you back, right?" "I'm okay. Let's go inside." "How'd you get rid of those dogs?" "I have a way with animals," Joaquin said convincingly, though before tonight he hadn't been aware of it. "There never used to be any dogs here," Colette said again. "Maybe the strikers brought them to watch for people breaking in, like us." Gabriel opened the door with ease. Picking locks was one of his many talents. All 3 entered the building. It was a mess. Windows were cracked and broken, puddles of water were everywhere, and documents, books, and folders littered the floor. This place had been abandoned for some time. "Well, if those were watchdogs, they're a fucking failure," Joaquin said. "We realized how incompetent they were when they let you go with that little scratch on the head," Gabriel remarked. Colette guided them through the darkness, following Martin's instructions until they reached the transformer. Gabriel gave the electric cables the once-over to make sure they corresponded to his diagram. Once he'd finished, he snapped a few Polaroids, and they headed for the broadcasting booth. Martin said we shouldn't turn on any lights on the ground floor. When they reached the booth, they were greeted by the stench of humidity and rot. The toilets had been torn out, but no one had bothered to shut off the water. The carpet was wet, and the walls were covered with mold. Colette nervously flicked on the light switch, and the whole room lit up. Gabriel and Joaquin got their instruments out of their backpacks. Everything was wet, but seemed in good working order. They hastily set up a crude altar, composed of a range of bizarre objects. Joaquin hadn't understood when Gabriel expressed the need for an altar, but now as it took shape, it seemed essential, as if the whole exercise would be pointless without it. Joaquin helped Gabriel carefully position the articles they'd brought with them. The flashlights, the old quick-clean bottles filled with suspect liquid, the toy soldiers, old coins, a dollhouse, a strange headdress, a knife, carved wooden symbols, drawings, and other items. "What are you doing?" Colette asked. "Can't you tell? We're asking the gods to watch over us." "Shit, you and your crap ideas about the Aztecs. Fucking thing looks like an Aztec altar designed by a retard or a senile old lady." "Awesome! Exactly what we're going for," Gabriel responded with a laugh. When Gabriel connected his guitar, he got a shock. A bolt of electricity arced from the instrument to his hand. "Son of a bitch!" he yelled. "Tonight the guitar will become an instrument of torture," Joaquin said. "We'll feel a little of the dead warrior's pain in our fingers. I can assure you it won't just be in our fingers. Those warriors would have preferred a few electric shocks to the obsidian knives they used to cut out their hearts," Colette said through the control booth speakers. "Better to have your heart ripped out than to smell the sewage water flooding this goddamn studio," Joaquin said. "Actually, the Aztec sewage system—" "Okay, girl, lose the Aztec history lesson and show us some of your broadcast expertise," Gabriel said, cutting her off. Colette moved over to the console, powered up, and played with the sliders, mixing the signals from the guitars, tapes, synthesizer, and drum machine. Watching her, Joaquin was turned on. The way her hands danced across the controls, how she cocked her head when something didn't sound quite right, and the sly grin that snaked across her face when it did. Everything was ready at around 1:30 in the morning. Gabriel took over the mic. On his first word, the amplifiers popped and the lights went out. It didn't take them long to find which fuse they'd blown, but they couldn't find a replacement. Joaquin sat down in the dark, defeated. His head was still bleeding. The dog bite throbbed, and they didn't have anything to clean or cover it. But Gabriel wouldn't give up. He found a thick cable and used it to bypass the fuse. The lights came back on. By 1:49 a.m., they were on the air. A red light went on in the studio. "As promised, we are Death Muertos, and we're liberating the airwaves of Mexico," Gabriel intoned. They started playing. They opened with Voices Gone Unheard, a classic punk challenge filled with rage, mounted on an intense percussion track composed entirely of insect sounds. It was the perfect opener, and it invariably left their audience turned on and hungry for more. Joaquin wasn't satisfied. He thought they sounded flat, and he signaled for Colette to adjust the bass, lower the monitors, and up the reverb. She did so, brushing the hair from her face with the back of the hand. They continued with Death Concealed Among the Civilians, a fusion of Afro-Caribbean elements with scratchy, aggressive vocals that gradually formed a counterpoint to synthesized string attacks inspired by Mahler. By then, both Joaquin and Gabriel had entered a trance-like state, playing as if possessed by the spirits of fallen warriors. Chapter 26. Euphoria. A group of around 100, maybe 150 youths had gathered in a small plaza. They had an old Mazda car radio connected to an amplifier. Some had been there since midnight. The locals couldn't figure out what they were waiting for. There were about 10 cops anxious to intervene, but with orders not to. It was clear that those attending this mysterious, improvised meeting were consuming alcoholic beverages and a wide variety of drugs. The cops could have started arresting people whenever they wanted. Suddenly someone jumped up on the roof of the Mazda and yelled, "They're on, motherfuckers!" As soon as the first chords were heard, all hell broke loose. An enraged, delirious mosh pit started vibrating to the music, exploding from the speakers. It was so powerful that the cops were frozen with dread. They could only stand aside, contemplating the crowd as if they were watching a UFO landing. The mob was like a rhythmic, hungry beast threatening to attack the handful of pedestrians looking on from the streets nearby. Someone threw a bottle. It was followed by several more. Then a rock went through a shop window. That was when the cops took action. The same scene played out in other cities. Some said 10, others over 100. It would be difficult to know for sure. What's certain is that the energy unleashed in those few minutes of the Death Muertos concert via Radio Mexico left an indelible mark. Politicians, activists, parents, and commentators all condemned the delirious outbreaks of violence. But no one who was there that night could deny that they'd remember those minutes of complete euphoria, mayhem, and release for the rest of their lives. Chapter 27. Miscalculation. Colette was livid. "The cops are outside. We've got to leg it now." "Sister, this jam is too hot. I ain't going anywhere." "I'm staying too," Joaquin said. "But you should go, shove a couple of those cabinets against the door, then climb out the bathroom window." Joaquin watched Colette, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Go," he said calmly as he pounded out another power cord. Colette moved to the double doors, pushing a couple of cabinets in front of them. "Enough?" she asked. Joaquin gestured to a large wooden shelf unit. Colette nodded and pushed it towards the doors. It squeaked and barked on its journey. Joaquin liked the sound. He hoped the mics were catching it. Colette tipped the unit over. It smashed against the doors loudly. The mics certainly picked that up. Colette shot Joaquin another questioning look. He nodded and watched her run toward the bathroom, its tiny window, and freedom. Now alone, Joaquin and Gabriel played Chismes y Deadly Legends, using a collection of noises that sounded like a funeral procession to add texture to the already vertigo-inducing 180 beat per minute composition. Their music had never sounded so vital and powerful. At 2 a.m., a surge in the electrical system blew out their equipment. Joaquin had already felt several minor shocks that night, but this time his arms, then his back and neck, tensed up till all his muscles were hard as a rock. He saw smoke rise from his flesh, and a burst of flame emerge from his mouth, and then a blow to the abdomen, and he was airborne. A moment of floating silence. Then, wham! Down onto the wet floor, the wind knocked out of him. Slowly his vision blurred. The world faded until he was left in darkness. He heard the mastiffs enter the studio and sniff at him. Then he heard something else, distant, indistinct. Voices. Music. As he struggled to make it out, he felt his body rising toward the ceiling. He looked down and saw Gabriel, prone on the floor. The dogs bit at his chest, tore at his face and crotch. He also saw his own body lying on the floor, immobile. The police burst into the studio. When they saw Joaquin and Gabriel on the ground, they called for paramedics. Joaquin was strangely calm as he watched the scene below. Suddenly everything around him shifted. The damp station evaporated, replaced by a vast, Arctic landscape. Joaquin felt the snow crunch under his feet. In the distance, jagged glaciers stretched skyward. Without knowing why, he began to climb the nearest snowdrift. He shivered as he trudged forward, each step harder than the last. He'd barely made it 20 yards before he found himself sinking into the snow. First to his ankles, then to his knees, then it almost reached his waist. He pushed on, unsure where he was going or why he found it imperative to continue. The snow was up to his chest now, and movement had become virtually impossible. He was using all his might to inch his way forward. A loud crack filled the air, and snow tumbled down on top of him. He felt like hundreds of icy blankets were being hurled on top of him. A suffocating fear gripped him as he struggled to break out. Suddenly he was free. The snow beneath him gave way, and he felt himself falling. He fell and he fell, and while he fell, he heard Gabriel's voice. "Why do you always fuck everything up, Joaquin? This isn't your place. You're not meant to be here. You're not meant to see this." He continued falling, and music replaced Gabriel's voice. A strange, booming music that reminded him of pistons and steam engines. It clanked and hissed and pounded and screeched. Then he hit the ground, hard. He looked up and saw a paramedic crouched over him, defibrillator paddles in each hand. The paramedic said some calming words that he couldn't make out, and then he lost consciousness. During the following week, A rumor circulated among their fans. Los Death Muertos would never play again. Chapter 28. Call 3307. Tuesday, 4:02 a.m. The Ghost Bride. My name is Yang, but call me Joe. Hi, Yang. Joe. What do you have for Ghost Radio today? Well, I know some people. And which people would those be? Not, good people. They're people who trade with the dead. What do you mean, trade with the dead? I mean that they, provide some special needs for some dead people. Yang or Joe, you lost me there. What needs? What are you talking about? See, in western China, in the Shaanxi province, there's a very old custom that says when a young man dies unmarried, he should be buried with a bride. A dead bride. You've heard of it? Now we have, said Joaquin. So these people, they provide women, female corpses for ghost weddings. Uh-huh. When an unmarried woman dies at the same time as an unmarried man, they speak to her family, offer them a small sum, and they bury the bodies together after a ceremony. And if there isn't some conveniently dead woman? Then there are other options. They go to villages and buy young women or girls, claiming that they are preparing an arranged marriage. And they kill them. That might be a scary story, but it sounds like more of a matter for Human Rights Watch than Ghost Radio, said Alondra. Well, here's the thing. A man that I know was in this business. He was doing nicely, providing brides all over the Yellow Earth Highlands and keeping the tradition alive by any and all means. He would buy a young woman for 10 to 12,000 yuan, that is, around $1,300 to $2,000, and sell her dead body for double. Or even better, he and his associates would kidnap prostitutes and girls from other provinces and kill them. When the demand for corpses was low, they would take care of a few young bachelors and later provide the ghost brides for the poor fellows. So this man called me at home in San Francisco. I needed money, and he offered me lots of it. I accepted, so he flew me to China, my ancestors' homeland, to help him. How do you know this guy? He's my uncle. Anyways, last summer was busy for us. I mostly took care of the business side. He and his associates would deal with the brides. On one occasion, though, my uncle asked me to go to a remote farm in Inner Mongolia to buy a girl named Lee. He explained what I should do, and soon I found myself in a hut making a deal with the girl's father. I told him I would marry his daughter. Finally, we reached an agreement. I paid 11,000 yuan and took her with me. From our first meeting, I'd been noticing a disgusting smell of yak's milk. As soon as we started the long trip back, she said, "I know what you're going to do with me." I tried to be like my uncle and ignore her, but I felt uncomfortable. When we got home, I tied Lee up and called my uncle to come take care of her, but he told me he was too busy and ordered me to do it myself. I felt queasy, but I gathered my courage and strangled her. They preferred that method of killing because it didn't damage the body. I put her in a big icebox, and the next day she was buried with her ghost groom. Usually that was the end of the story. That night, though, I heard strange noises coming from the icebox. I grabbed a stick and walked over to it, thinking that a rat or something might have crawled inside. But as soon as I opened it, Lee popped up like a jack-in-the-box. I fell back, terrified. Her ghost stood before me and spoke. "I reject my groom. I have already chosen a different one." She approached me. "I choose you." The smell of fermented yak's milk coming from her mouth was unbearable. I stood up and ran from the house, screaming, but the aroma stuck to me. It followed me on the buses and trains I took to get to Beijing, and on the plane back to San Francisco. The passenger sitting in the seat next to me asked the stewardess to move him because of the stench. By then I didn't care what people said because my body was slowly rotting. My flesh was decomposing, my organs turning to mush. I am only 32, but by the time I arrived in the United States, I looked 60. I could hardly see, and my hands were trembling uncontrollably. Every time I turned my head, I saw Lee out of the corner of my eye. I went home, but I was too scared to be alone. I don't know why, but with my remaining money, I took a room in a hotel. I turned on all the lights, the TV, and a radio that I bought at a drugstore. I sat on a chair with my back against the wall, hoping against hope I would be safe from Lee. But it didn't work. I realized Lee was in the bed, lying there stiffly. I was terrified, but I didn't move. All she said was, "I will be waiting here for you." I was so exhausted and miserable and hopeless that I just sat there looking at her, knowing that eventually I would have to join her in a deathly embrace. "And how did you get away, Joe?" "I didn't. I'm still in the chair looking at Lee. I just wanted to tell someone." The line went dead. Chapter 29. The Police Operation. One night, during an electrical storm out in the deserts of northern Mexico, Joaquin died and came back. It sounded like something out of a B-movie or maybe even a horror bestseller, but the Mexican feds weren't impressed by these apparent wonders. Even though Joaquin was carried out of the radio station unconscious and seriously injured, reeking of burned leather, they still handcuffed his right wrist to the stretcher, just in case. Despite the sporadic protests of a doctor or two, they kept him handcuffed either to the bed or the plumbing for most of the time between his arrival in intensive care and his assignment to a private room. The weekend before, Irineo Pantoja had attended the funerals of two of his officers. He knew he was fighting a losing battle. He had neither the resources nor the guts to go up against the drug cartels that were using his city as a hub to channel their merchandise to U.S. cities. Pantoja had risen to the rank of police chief only through a lack of other candidates. One by one, all the bravest, most competent policemen, the ones least likely to take bribes, had been murdered. Pantoja narrowly escaped several attempts himself. He'd gotten used to saying goodbye to his face in the mirror every morning because he knew he might never see it again. When, at 1:40 a.m., they informed him that someone had taken over the university radio station, he jumped out of bed. It's a sign, he thought. A patrol car picked him up a few minutes later, and he rushed off to spearhead the operation. The report he was handed said that the people responsible for seizing the station were rock musicians, probably gringos, who were just screwing around. That information didn't register. Pantoja had a totally different interpretation. This was a bluff, orchestrated by his enemies in order to humiliate him. It wasn't just about breaking and entering. It wasn't a teenage prank. It was evil forces taking over the city. The police chief saw this as an opportunity, maybe his last, to show the drug lords that they couldn't use the city as their playground. He decided not to wait, not to negotiate. His subordinates were surprised, but no one objected when the order came. Shoot to kill. These are extremely dangerous criminals. Have the paramedics ready and waiting. No one believed him, but most of the agents went in ready for a fight anyway. Paradoxically, instead of bullets, they were met by an explosion, caused by the same short circuit that had electrocuted Gabriel and Joaquin. Hours later, Pantoja made a statement to the press. He claimed that the survivor, whose name and identity were unknown, was an international hitman. He confirmed that this man had been hired by the Pacific Cartel and that invading the station was part of a conspiracy to take control of the broadcast media. No further explanation was ever provided. The press didn't question his absurd logic. It was a good story, so they ran with it. Chapter 30. The Rescue. When Joaquin opened his eyes in the hospital, he expected Gabriel to appear at any moment, burned, in bad shape, but alive. He imagined Gabriel smiling and tossing off some jokes about escaping another one. Gabriel was dead, of course. Joaquin knew this, but he couldn't shake the feeling of an impending reunion. He'd known it from the moment the surge blew him off the ground in the radio station. However, they hadn't officially informed him, and he clung to this, hoping against hope that someone would come in to announce that Gabriel wasn't dead after all. He knew it was a pointless fantasy, but it was the only thing that kept him going. When he'd first come to, he'd discovered he was mute. With his hands bandaged, he couldn't write either. This set off an attack of hysteria, and several orderlies had to hold him down and administer a strong sedative. This confirmed the generalized fear around the hospital that he was a violent killer. Joaquin didn't know what condition his hands were in, or whether he'd even be able to use them again. He knew it was possible to lose extremities from an electric shock. He'd once heard of someone losing an arm. He imagined the worst. Often the doctors spoke freely around him, as if he couldn't understand them. One said there was no doubt his fucking vocal cords are scarred. Joaquin desperately tried to shout, to scream, but it only irritated his throat, sending him into violent coughing fits while the indifferent doctors horsed around and made obscene jokes, and the 2 attending nurses howled with laughter. In his confusion, Joaquin found himself joining in their amusement. If he ever got out of there, he thought, scarred vocal cords would be a good name for a band. One day, Pantoja paid Joaquin a visit. Joaquin had spent most of the morning straining against his handcuffs, reopening the abrasions on his wrists in the process. 2 officers accompanied Pantoja. They wanted to know what Joaquin's name was, where he lived, and where his accomplices were hiding out. They demanded that he confess. "Better do it now. The longer you wait, the more it's gonna hurt," one of the cops said with a smile. Pantoja kept silent, staring at Joaquin. Joaquin wondered what he might be thinking. He couldn't tell. Pantoja's eyes were too blank and cold. They stared past him, through him, and he stood stock still, waiting, as his subordinate continued questioning. Then finally, "Give me a minute alone with this suspect," Pantoja calmly told the 2 officers. After they left, Joaquin noticed a hint of animation entering Pantoja's eyes. "Who are you?" he asked. Joaquin tried to return the icy stare. "I asked you a question," Pantoja told him. Joaquin didn't blink. 2 could play this game, he told himself as he tried to inject some hostility into his expression. He knew his eyes didn't match Pantoja's steely weapons, but he hoped he could make up for that with a mute passivity. Pantoja held his gaze for several seconds, then turned and left the room. Joaquin sighed, reveling in this small victory. But then the crushing strangeness of his situation pressed in on him. Here he was, injured, in pain, and accused of being part of a drug cartel. All he wanted to do was grieve for Gabriel, but circumstances wouldn't let him. He had a new battle to fight, but maybe Gabriel would like it that way. He'd never been one for maudlin displays. This situation would be a new entry in his Polaroid diary. Joaquin, the master criminal. For a moment, this thought made him feel alive again. Gabriel's joking, irreverent soul felt very near. Joaquin sighed again, this time not with relief or satisfaction, but at the enormity of his emotions. He wished he had someone to talk to. But, unlike his last hospital stay, this time Joaquin found no friendliness or complicity among the hospital staff. Most of them avoided him. The nurses who brought him his food didn't say a single word. They left the tray and scurried out as if they feared he hosted some horrible contagion. At times, feigning sleep, he heard them whispering that the cops had said that he was a notorious, sadistic drug trafficker, the kind who cut off people's heads and murdered whole families with hammers and hacksaws. One nurse even worried aloud about a squad of hitmen armed with AK-47s storming the hospital, guns blazing, kicking down doors, tossing grenades, and killing doctors in order to free their boss. He even heard rumors that hospital officials had requested security backup from the city, the state, and federal government. Joaquin wasn't sure what was going to happen, but he knew that the most important thing was to protect his identity. For the time being, they referred to Gabriel as the Rat, a known local thug, and gloated over his death. They hadn't picked a name for Joaquin yet. However, it was clear they were using him as a scapegoat, and he was in no condition to defend himself. All he could look forward to was a long stay in a high-security prison, unless things changed drastically and the authorities recognized they'd made a mistake. After 2 weeks in the hospital, Joaquin was able to walk and talk again. However, he was very careful not to show any sign of his progress. He thought it gave him a small advantage. Of course, he was still gravely injured, weak and fragile, but he was already planning his escape. He'd considered several options. All were equally dangerous, unrealistic, and, lamentably, more inspired by Houdini than by reality. He thought maybe he could disguise himself as a doctor and walk right out the main door, or even rung bell out the window using a rope made of knotted sheets. He tried to keep track of those moments when he wasn't under the intense gaze of the guards, as well as when he wasn't handcuffed or tied down. The time he spent in the bathroom seemed like the best option. Every chance he got, he tested how much they'd let him get away with while he was alone. Unfortunately, it wasn't much. On the contrary, every day there were more and more guards, and lately, elite cops complete with bulletproof vests, helmets, machine guns, their faces hidden by ski masks. One morning, while eating breakfast, he heard an explosion in the hallway. At first, he thought it must be demolition or remodeling. Then another, louder explosion sounded closer to his room. Shouts and gunfire followed, and then more explosions. Through the door, Joaquin heard howls, orders, and cries for help. Some of it filtered through the beep and crackle of walkie-talkies. Instinctively, he launched himself from the bed, but the handcuffs stopped him, leaving him dangling off the edge, the cuffs cutting into his wrists. As he struggled to pull himself back onto the bed, the sounds of battle moved closer. They were horrific noises, primordial animal sounds, not clean or easy like an action movie, but jumbled and desperate and ugly. They told him two things. One, outside his room, people were fighting for their lives. And two, they were headed his way. As he dragged himself back onto the bed, he tried to assess the situation. Who were these people? Why were they fighting? But his mind wouldn't work. The sounds in the hallway pushed away rational thought, replaced it with the desire for survival. He screamed and pulled at his restraints, but it was hopeless. He wasn't Houdini. There was no way out. Finally, he just lay back on the pillow and closed his eyes, resigned to his fate. For some moments, he stayed like that, letting his mind drift away. Then he heard the door smashing open. He turned and lifted his lids slightly and saw a man with a machine gun head his way. Joaquin squeezed his eyes shut. He heard the sound of boots moving across the floor toward him, and then a voice saying, "We've come for you." He thought he recognized the voice, but he couldn't be sure about anything. He was so terrified that he didn't dare look the stranger in the face. He kept his eyes firmly shut. He heard the jangle of keys in the man's hand, and seconds later was released from his handcuffs. "Open your eyes, you moron, and get up," the visitor demanded. Joaquin complied, but wouldn't look directly at his rescuer. A backpack landed at his feet. "Get dressed." Confused and so dizzy that he could barely stand, Joaquin pulled some pants and a shirt from the bag. He immediately recognized them. They were Gabriel's. As he was putting on the shirt, carefully because of the bandages, the door flew open again. 3 police officers burst in, pointing their weapons in all directions. Joaquin threw himself on the ground, covering his face with both hands. The cops shouted out confused orders. "Freeze! Hands in the air! Down on the floor! Now!" Through his fingers, Joaquin saw each officer cover one flank as they moved step by step into the room, fingers on triggers. Then the guns turned on Joaquin. "Where's the guy who released you?" Joaquin had no idea where his mysterious rescuer had gone, but he was certain that he couldn't have gone far. Just then, Pantoja came in, accompanied by another agent. The officers moved aside to let him through. All he said was, "Where is he?" Joaquin raised his head a little, trying to get a look at the chief of police as he drew closer. He felt a kick in the ribs. "Don't move, asshole," one of the cops hissed. That's when Joaquin heard the first shot. Then the officer who'd kicked him collapsed, a jet of blood spurting from his neck. The other cops ran for cover, some of them firing randomly. One accidentally shoved Pantoja in his desperate attempt to find a hiding place. The chief of police fell on his back and, as he tried to get to his feet, took a bullet in the shoulder. The cacophony of bullets and screams was deafening. One officer was shot in the face, another in the leg. Joaquin dragged himself under the bed. From this vantage point, he saw another officer slammed against the wall by a bullet. With a grimace of pain and despair, he slid slowly to the ground, leaving a smear of blood. He twitched a few times and stopped moving. With no one left standing, the shooter reappeared. "You better get out from under there or the mice are going to get you," he said. But Joaquin was paralyzed. From under the bed, he couldn't see anything but the shooter's legs heading for Pantoja. The chief of police was gasping for air, pressing down on his wound with one hand, trying to stop the bleeding. Joaquin could clearly see his face. The expression in his eyes changed quickly from pain to rage to terror. Yes, Ireneo. It won't hurt for very much longer. You knew. You knew from the start how this day would end. This morning in front of the mirror, you were finally right. Isn't that a bitch? Knowing when it's all gonna end. Joaquin thought he recognized Gabriel's voice, but he was too scared to trust his senses. The shooter aimed at Pantoja's forehead and fired 1, 2, 3 times. Joaquin couldn't watch. He closed his eyes and waited. Just then a hand grabbed his shoulder. "We've got to go now," the killer said. Joaquin's eyes were still squeezed shut. When he opened them, he deliberately looked the other way. This was partly to show his unexpected rescuer that he hadn't seen his face, and therefore couldn't finger him if they caught him again. But it was also because he was frightened to look in the eyes of the man who could inflict so much violence, who sounded like Gabriel. He could never have imagined that this fear, which seemed so irrational at the time, would eventually become such a familiar feeling. As he walked beside the gunman, Joaquin repeated words to himself like a mantra. Gabriel didn't kill people. Gabriel wasn't part of a cartel. Gabriel is dead. As if this way he could ground his thoughts. The idea of escaping from a hospital with the help of a killer was already shocking enough without adding a heap of metaphysical concerns. The shooter pulled Joaquin through the hallways. Chaos enveloped them. Through the smoke and shouting, sirens could be heard. Joaquin wasn't in any condition to go anywhere, and he felt vertigo, pain, and nausea with each step. His vision tunneled. He was blacking out. He couldn't understand why no one was trying to stop them. Moments later, he felt sunlight. They were outside, walking on the pavement. His rescuer shoved him into a Chevy Suburban, waiting on the curb with the motor running. He said something to the driver, closed the door, and the vehicle took off. In the rearview mirror, Joaquin watched the shooter's back as he walked tranquilly away. No one followed him. Exhausted, all he could say was, "Wake me up when we get there." He didn't have the slightest idea where they were going. Chapter 31. Return to the City of Palaces. Joaquin slept for hours. When he awoke, the first thing he saw out the window of the SUV was a sign reading, "Welcome to Mexico City." But Mexico City was different than he remembered it. The capital had turned into a gigantic, indescribable monster, an amorphous mass of gray and ochre. The city of Joaquin's childhood had disappeared, buried under a mountain of toxic sludge. He barely believed what he saw. It was like the landscape in a fever dream. He'd longed to return to the capital after his parents died. He'd dreamed of home, school, the Zocalo, the Zona Rosa district. He had imagined the feelings that would course through his body, feelings of nostalgia or dread or desire. But now, entering the streets of his city, he was just tired and hungry. The driver handed him a bottle of water. After taking a few gulps, Joaquin considered the driver. He had a clipped mustache, cinnamon-colored skin, and blue eyes. He chain-smoked as he drove. His cell phone rang several times, and each time he glanced down at it, but didn't answer. Joaquin refused to speak to him. He didn't know what the relationship was between this man and the killer who'd liberated him from the clutches of the police, but he guessed the driver must be a subordinate. Another killer, no doubt, who, for the time being, had been relegated to the lesser station of chauffeur. Joaquin had grown accustomed to silence during his hospital stay. Silence was good, he told himself. Silence was comforting. Silence was his new religion. Of course, this didn't stop his mind from racing. He couldn't stop the questions. Why had he been rescued? Who were these people? Where was he being taken? There was no point in interrogating the driver. He felt his only advantage lay in the fact that his identity remained a secret. If the drug lords thought he was someone else, he'd be in serious danger when they found out they had the wrong man. He didn't think these particular businessmen would take it lightly if they found out they'd made a mistake. Moreover, a lot of cops, and who knows how many others, had been killed during the rescue. and Joaquin was tortured by the thought that it was all his fault. Then again, there could be no doubt that whoever had done this possessed a grim determination. After the events in the hospital, he knew that this was no game, knew they must think he was valuable in some way. His only consolation was the fact that he hadn't hurt anyone, and that in a way he was just another victim of these monstrous crimes. Joaquin looked out the window of the SUV at this city of scars, of sad, expressionless buildings. Where was the famed city of palaces, the flower-filled capital of gardens and majestic structures? Maybe the Mexico City of his memories had never really existed, a childhood fantasy that had accreted over the years, finally achieving mythic proportions. This disappointed him, devastated him even. But given his current condition, there were more important things to worry about. Just as he'd spent every moment in the hospital trying to devise a way to escape, now he considered the question of how he could jump out of the moving vehicle. Or should he wait until they reached a street with heavy traffic, get out at a light, and lose himself in the throng? He wondered if the driver would fire into a crowd. Then he remembered the hospital, and his doubts evaporated. These people were capable of anything. They drove past avenues that looked familiar. Gradually, in spite of the traffic, the atrocious pollution, the kids who cleaned off windshields at the street corners, he began to feel like he was back in his city. As they approached the downtown area, the Alameda, the Palace of Fine Arts, the Mining Palace, and all the other postcard attractions, the wounded megalopolis recovered its mystique and charm. Joaquin felt a wave of optimism. Nothing bad could happen to him there. Not even a cartel of drug lords and murderers could harm him in these streets. This was his city. Here he could be a king. These thoughts encouraged him and helped him keep his cool even as the SUV started winding through the narrow streets near Garibaldi Plaza. Suddenly the driver stopped the car. He turned off the motor and lit another cigarette. "We're here." Joaquin looked at him, trying not to give himself away. He nodded his head as if he knew what the man was talking about. "You're going to go to that hotel over there. Lie low for a few days, maybe weeks. Don't call any attention to yourself. It's most likely that in a little while they'll stop looking for you. After all, you're lucky. They don't know anything about you." "That's it?" Joaquin finally asked, unable to restrain himself from speaking any longer. "Don't worry," the driver said through a cloud of cigarette smoke. "Someone's watching your back." Joaquin wanted to ask what he meant, but he had already started up the SUV's motor. His stare made Joaquin understand that he didn't have any more time for him. "They're expecting you at the hotel." Joaquin got out, knowing that he could go wherever he wanted now. He weighed his options. As he moved away from the vehicle, he thought about looking up the house of some friend or relative, but no one came to mind, so he walked toward the hotel. The driver yelled a few parting words. "He'll be in touch when the time is right." He closed the windows and took off. Joaquin went in and found the front desk of the hotel. An old man gave him a key. "Room 303. They told me you needed some rest." "Yes, I've got to lie down. But first I'd like some food," he said. Then he remembered he had no money. As if he could read minds, the man handed him a fat envelope. "They left this for you," he said. Joaquin opened it discreetly and saw a bundle of crisp pesos secured with a fat rubber band. There was also a note. It read, "Take it. You'll pay me back later." No signature. But he couldn't shake the nagging, inexplicable feeling that Gabriel somehow had something to do with all of this. Now, though, he was tired and hungry. Without wasting another thought on it, he put the money in his pocket, took the key, and headed for the restaurant. Chapter 32. Quantum Flux. "Reality isn't my friend." "What a great way to begin a call," said Joaquin, chuckling. "Perhaps, but it's not a great way to live a life," the caller said, a note of controlled desperation in his voice. Joaquin recognized the tone. That was a laugh of commiseration. "Reality isn't my friend either," he said, hoping to relax the caller. "I can't seem to get a handle on it. Most of the time I just accept that I'm crazy, dreaming of the day insanity takes over, obliterating everything. What exactly is happening? It began with my furniture. Each day I'd wake up to find it had changed. One day I have a leather sofa. The next day it's some ratty cloth job from the Goodwill. The tables, chairs, pictures on the walls, everything would change. One day I had no furniture at all, just a mattress on the floor of my bedroom and a few old lamps in some of the other rooms. And no matter what furniture I found in the morning, it always looked familiar. I could remember its history. A friend helping me pick it out, or lugging it up the stairs, or whatever. Joaquin liked the caller's voice, a cool baritone, perfect for radio. He wished more callers had good radio voices. But I also remember the old furniture. Even right now, I have more than 600 distinct memories of decorating this apartment, all memories from the same week, the week I moved in. And then what happened? It began spreading to other areas of my life. First with friends. I'd wake and have a completely different circle of friends. And sometimes friends that were dead one day would be alive the next. Some days I was married, some single. Some days I was even gay. And all of these facts were tied to distinct memories, to lives I'd clearly lived, but hadn't. And then it was everything, jobs, family, even the city I called home. Everything changed, everything. Every day I woke up to an entirely different life and went to sleep knowing I'd find a new one in the morning. One day last week I was on death row. A man who lived in a state of pure quantum flux. Joaquin had never encountered a person like this. He never had a call like this. It always made him happy when he found a treat for his listeners. Even if this guy was lying, it was still a great story. It was also great radio. In the last few days, it has gotten worse. It used to be that one reality would maintain itself through an entire day. That was a small comfort. But a few days ago, that changed. Now the shifts occur suddenly. I barely know from minute to minute who I am, where I am. And yet, part of me knows it all. Joaquin sighed. This was getting tedious. Jack, we like your story, but you can't keep calling and telling it. You've already called 3 times this month with the same story. I know, I'm sorry. But when I began this call, I'd never called before. I'd never even listened to Ghost Radio before tonight. That's a nice spin, but it's not gonna fly. Call back when something new happens, Jack. I didn't even give my name. The line went dead. Joaquin took a pull off his coffee and smiled. He liked Sam's calls and his weekly reports about his shifting reality. Joaquin hoped he would call again. Ghost Radio needed more callers like Bert. He hoped the next time Tim called, he'd put his wife, Phyllis, on the line. Sarah made for good radio, too. He hoped she'd never call again. Chapter 33. Miss Wikipedia and the Urban Legends. There were nights when, no matter how insistent the calls, how heated the debates, and how tearful the confessions, I had a tough time maintaining my focus on my callers' voices. I drifted, losing my concentration. My mind wandered, filling with thoughts unrelated to the show, thoughts of women I'd slept with, great meals I'd eaten, and cool summer evenings on the beaches of Chiapas. What kind of life was it to grow old in some decrepit broadcasting booth? To become a radio institution, or, more likely, one more disgusting old goat who stays on the air until he's dead. When this happened, I drank dozens of cups of coffee, splashed water on my face, all the tricks one uses to stay alert, but nothing worked. Well, that's not true. One thing always worked. A great call. A call that electrified the entire studio. That night I felt a bit dizzy. I thought maybe I was coming down with a cold. A call came in. Not great. Not electrifying. He told a story about a friend of a friend who'd met a gorgeous blonde, taken her to a club, and after a few hours of passion, toasted her with champagne in which she'd dissolved some kind of narcotic. The next morning, he woke up in pain with a strange scar on his side. Right? I said, cutting him off. No way. Yeah. Because they'd removed one of his kidneys to sell in the black market, I continued impatiently. Yeah. That's what we call an urban legend. A story passed down orally through the naive complicity of people who believe the phrase, "It happened to the friend of a friend of mine," I said, emphasizing the last few words. No, it's true. It really happened to my friend's friend. Anything can happen to that mysterious friend of a friend because it always happens far away from us, and there's never any way of proving it. It's the folklore of our era. The constant reappropriation of grotesque anecdotes. No, I'm telling you, it really happened. You don't believe me? What I can't believe is that there's still someone out there who believes this crap. I've heard this one before, with a couple of variations. In one, the gorgeous woman writes a message to the friend of a friend on the hotel mirror that reads, "Welcome to the world of AIDS," or something along those lines. In others, like the one about your friend's friend, it's all about organ trafficking. If 1% of these stories were true, this blonde of yours would not only be an active threat, but an authentic serial offender. So I guess I have no choice but to warn our listeners to never, never trust a gorgeous blonde who is ready to hop in the sack with you. Fortunately, in the real world, at least the one I live in, the danger of that happening is extremely low. "You're making fun of me." "Yes," I said. "Jeez." I'd make fun of anyone who believes this crap. Because if you buy those stories, I can't imagine the other kinds of bullshit your friend and your friend's friend are going to make you swallow. And people like me might suffer the blowback. People who aren't total morons. "To some extent, these stories have a lot in common with jokes," Alondra interjected, trying to lighten the mood. "They're passed around, and we can repeat what we've heard without necessarily having to cite our sources. The objective is to trigger a reaction. In both cases, there's often a moral, a twist. In jokes, obviously, it's comical, and in urban legends, horrific." But Alondra's interruption did not change my mood. I entered what she called the annoying spiral, an intensifying state of fury, in which the whole planet conspires against Joaquin to drive him up the wall, or so I think. "Bullshit, bullshit. It's for real. It really happened. And Miss Wikipedia can just keep out of this," the caller said. "Miss Wikipedia?" Alondra repeated in a low voice, her finger on the cough button. "I'm sorry to inform you that you've been conned. In fact, now that you mention it, it might not be a bad idea for you to consult Wikipedia before calling. And by the way, my colleague Alondra has a PhD in urban folklore." Alondra grimaced. She didn't like to be defended when she could do it herself, nor did she like her credentials to be flaunted as if they were medals. "Goddamn stupid broad," the caller exclaimed. "In other words, in addition to suffering from a pitiful childlike gullibility, you also hate women." "Tell us how it all began," I said. "Your mommy didn't nurse you?" "You're a major asshole. Go and get yourself bleep." Watt cut off the caller's last words. I engaged in conversations like this every night, sometimes several times a night. Usually I'd just let it go, but other times I'd take it personally, as if the caller had picked a fight directly with me and not with my disembodied voice. I wanted to hit, to punch, to kick. I wanted to take something beautiful and make it ugly. This was how I felt when a call came through on line 2. "Joaquin, I want to tell you about something that happened to me. My wife and I had our first child, Edward, a year ago. When he was 11 months old, we decided to have him sleep alone in his own bedroom. It's a transition that's difficult for all parents. It took us several tries until we were able to stand hearing him cry without rushing in right away to pick him up. At night, we'd turn on the baby monitor and we'd listen to him babble, eventually fall asleep. One night, I woke up to what sounded like an adult voice on the monitor. I thought my wife had gone in to check on the baby, but there she was, sleeping beside me. And the voice I'd heard didn't sound like hers. I thought I might have dreamed it, but I went into my son's room anyway. Edward wasn't asleep. He was awake, on his knees, grabbing onto one side of his crib. I was a little scared when I saw him, wide awake and motionless like that. Usually when he opened his eyes, it wouldn't be 3 seconds before he'd start crying or calling out to us. This time was very different. He seemed calm, like he hardly even realized I was there. The episode surprised me, but so many other things surprised and worried me every day. Whether he ate or not, whether he walked or crawled, whether he repeated words or played with his toys in a safe way. I brushed this strange voice aside as single memory among countless others, until I heard it again. I was awake this time and heard it very clearly, like a strange gibberish forming unrecognizable words. I don't know what language it was, but I can't forget the rasping, inhuman quality it had. I was immobilized for a few seconds, unable to stand up or even speak. I ran back to my son's room. Before I'd even looked at the crib, I knew something terrible had happened. Then I saw a sort of shadow thing scurrying into the corner, and Edward wasn't there. I started screaming, calling for help, completely out of my mind. My wife ran in, and without even knowing what was going on, she started screaming too. We haven't stopped looking. We haven't given up. But I know that what I heard was the voice of whoever or whatever took Edward away. None of us spoke for several seconds. Several long seconds. Any of us could have said this was another urban legend. One more tall tale passed on along biological vectors by people who circulated it, enriched it, added credibility by including emotions and an element of spontaneity. But no one said so because we knew this wasn't the case. I offered clumsy words of compassion for the caller's loss. The caller had already hung up. The tone of the show changed at that moment. It became darker, more serious, and remained that way for the rest of the night. It felt like a funeral parlor rather than a radio station. The link between the inhuman voice and the child's disappearance was tenuous, unbelievable, and barely justifiable, and yet it seemed unquestionable. It felt true. Chapter 34. Call 2412, Friday, 2:15 a.m. Icy Cliff. I want to tell you about something that happened to me last year. It's not a ghost story, strictly speaking. And then again, maybe it is. Sounds like fun. Lay it on us, said Joaquin. A long sigh came over the speakers. Then the caller spoke. I've sailed the seas my whole life. I learned the trade when I was a boy, from my father, as he'd learned from his father. We lived in the icy waters of the North Pole, and from the time I turned 16, it was my responsibility to steer shipments between enormous icebergs and floes. Nothing thrilled me more. I came to know the most treacherous routes of the Arctic by heart. I was one of the few sailors who'd venture out in small boats, without the considerable advantages provided by satellites and GPS navigation. After the Soviet Union disintegrated in 1990, new markets opened up and a lot of unprecedented trade opportunities emerged for those of us who knew these waters. I stopped working for other people, and I was able to buy one vessel, then another. I couldn't believe my good fortune. Although it wasn't just luck. It was due to my fearlessness toward the ice, and the fact that I'd take routes few others dared to attempt. Everyone in the business considered me an expert in navigating the narrow labyrinth of channels that forms between the Arctic floes. But even though I impressed colleagues and clients alike with my dexterity and skill, I could never convince my wife that I knew what I was doing. She tried everything in her power to get me to follow the example of my competitors. She didn't seem to realize that by doing so I'd lose my clients and the privileges we enjoyed. She also didn't understand that, more than any economic incentives, what really motivated me was the excitement of competing against the ice. Creating new passages where no one else dared to go, feeling the ship escape the frozen jaws of the icebergs time and time again. Determined to convince her that there was no real danger, and also partly, I admit, because I wanted to impress her, I took her along on a voyage. She'd never sailed those waters or set foot in an Arctic seaport and was terrified. I had to resort to every sort of pressure, deception, and blackmail you could imagine to get her on board. Before long, I was showing her how I could knock a day off the trip by traversing a passage between the floes so narrow it looked like a piece of string. The sound of ice rubbing against the ship's hull always gave me pleasure, but naturally it filled her with fear. My crew knew me and trusted me, even though they all understood the constant danger of becoming trapped in the ice. Joaquin sank down into his chair and covered his face with his hands, listening to the call with his eyes closed. Suddenly he felt a deep shiver rock his body. He realized instantly what was happening. It wasn't the first time he'd found himself in this situation. He slowly, apprehensively opened his eyes to find himself on the deck of a ship. The broadcasting studio, Alondra, Watt, the radio station, the building, the city had all disappeared. Next to him, the captain looked around, visibly concerned. It was cold. Joaquin couldn't move, couldn't control his body in any way. He breathed deeply, trying to remain calm. The narrator stood only a few steps away, but he looked right through Joaquin. I'm a ghost in this world, Joaquin thought, finding an eerie pleasure in the notion. Our second night out of port, we found a sinuous corridor that seemed safe to me. I estimated it would remain navigable for at least a couple more hours, more than enough time to run the gauntlet and save myself the trouble of a long detour. When we'd advanced into the passage, though, the ice started shifting much more quickly than I'd expected. I evaluated our options and decided our best shot would be to press on, full steam ahead. My wife was asleep. The ship struggled for a while, and then suddenly halted. Everyone ran around on deck. I knew all too well what would happen next, but I couldn't bring myself to accept it. I pushed the engine hard. It rumbled and screamed. We didn't budge, but the ice did, pushing in on us from all sides. Joaquin watched the narrator come up on deck, seeing and hearing the ice that surrounded them on all sides. The narrow corridor of water had disappeared. The ice pressed up against the sides of the ship, which groaned under the strain. I ran down to my wife. I longed to believe that the ice would stop moving, would open up again, but I knew it wasn't going to. People were shouting everywhere. When I reached the cabin, she was sitting on the bed, frozen with panic. I wanted to calm her down, to reassure her, but I could only gaze at her helplessly. Things were happening much faster than I could have imagined. The ship started to cave. I tried to run to my wife, to grab onto her, but I wasn't able to. The cabin had suddenly split in two. The geometry of the space changed in an instant. It turned from a rough cube to a parallelogram, broken down the middle. The bed rapidly sank into the crack, disappearing under the water. The staircase on which I stood pushed upward until my legs lodged between the timbers. I heard the hull crumpling around me. The sound was like a scream, and gave the impression that a gigantic sea monster was slowly devouring us all. The beast screamed again. The timbers shifted and broke, pushing me upward. Then I felt something like giant fingers wrapping around my body. Floorboards exploded around Joaquin, showering him with tiny splinters. He heard the rumble of other explosions below deck. It vibrated under his feet. Some crew members leaped over the railings, jumping out onto the ice. They knew the danger. They would not last more than a minute if they fell into the icy sea. Another explosion rocked the ship. It knocked Joaquin off his feet. Jumping up, he rushed to the railing. The captain lay on the ice, his feet splayed out awkwardly beneath him. And moving away from the captain was the shadow of something like arms. The ship pitched, sending Joaquin over the railing. He tumbled through the air and landed on the ice next to the captain. Joaquin rolled on the frozen surface and remained motionless, looking up at the starry sky. I saw these long, skinny arms coming out from the water. I know it sounds ridiculous, but they grabbed me and threw me to the ice. This thing saved me, although I didn't want to be saved. The fact I didn't go down with my ship that night, that I spent 2 days unconscious on an iceberg, seems to me like a kind of cruel punishment. A Norwegian icebreaker rescued me. They never found my wife. My crewmen all lost their lives, even those who survived the shipwreck and were scattered on the ice. They say I'll walk again someday. I hope I can. So I'll be able to walk all the way back to the Arctic. But even if I can't, I'll drag myself into the sea first chance I get, to pay off my debt from that night. At the sound of the caller's closing words, Joaquin's out-of-body experience came to an end. In the blink of an eye, the Arctic night gave way to the soft lights of the broadcasting studio. After announcing his plan to take his own life, the narrator fell silent. Watt and Alondra looked at Joaquin expectantly, but Joaquin couldn't speak, could barely move his hands. He would have had trouble shooing away a fly. Finally he spoke. What a devastating story. But the fact that you survived is a privilege, an opportunity to start over again, not a punishment. Even when all is lost, you can never give up. He didn't believe a single word he was saying. In fact, he thought the caller was right, but he knew he couldn't say something like that on the air. Anyway, the caller probably knew he was lying. The whole world probably knew. He felt numb, as if he really had been exposed to the sub-zero temperatures of the North Pole, and he was shivering, discreetly but uncontrollably. The caller said he didn't want to die without telling his story first. He said the only thing that mattered was that someone else hear it, so his story wouldn't disappear along with his wife and his ship. The caller hung up. Watt went to a commercial. Still, Joaquin couldn't stop shivering. What's wrong with you? Alondra asked. I was out there on the ice. It's happening again. You've got to see a doctor. Chapter 35. Ghost Radiogenesis. It's late, and I don't know what I'm doing. These waking dreams are beginning to unhinge me. But tonight, rather than dwelling on my confused emotional state, I find myself thinking back to the events that led to the creation of Ghost Radio. It began during a strange period in my life. Although years had passed since Gabriel's death, the pall of that event still hung over me, lending a darkness to even the brightest days. I was living in the Mixcoac neighborhood of Mexico City and working a variety of radio jobs, ranging from gigs as fill-in producer or guest announcer to grabbing the occasional disc jockey or talk show slot. I felt directionless. I wandered through the murky bars of Mexico City, daring the world to attack me. I inhaled the darkness and all that came with it. I drank every night, trying to erase my memories of Gabriel, our musical ambitions, and the events that brought me here. Numb and alone, my days blurred together, but my warrior instinct pushed me onward. It pushed me toward my destiny. I had just left an after-hours club and was stumbling down the street in search of another when a limousine pulled up beside me. A man leaned out the window and called to me in a vaguely familiar voice. I couldn't make out the face. The man urged me to get into the limousine. I mumbled something about wanting more alcohol and lurched off down the street. The limo's doors opened behind me, and before I knew it, strong arms grabbed me in a vice-like grip and dragged me toward the vehicle. I found myself in the back of the limousine. The man introduced himself as the Rat, but something about him reminded me of Gabriel. I cannot remember what happened during the rest of the night. I have murky recollections of bars and women and pain. I remember singing and playing an instrument. I remember the Rat's voice, talking, encouraging me. Your life is about to become real. The past is a prologue. Prepare for the future, my friend. It seemed as though he repeated this over and over again. But maybe he only said it once. I can't be sure. I woke the next morning at home in my own bed with a dull pain in my arm. I looked down and saw a bandage. I ripped it away and was shocked to find a strange tattoo, a collection of letters arranged in an odd pattern. E-N-I-T-N-U-J-A-A-B-N. Shortly after that night, I was offered a regular gig as a DJ on a local radio station. On my first night, I received a telegram that read, "Joaquin, congratulations on the new job. The past is a prologue. The Rat." Several months later, I took my first call about a ghost. Chapter 36. Why Want? Before he met Alondra, Joaquin had dated Elena, a beautiful, aspiring TV personality and former tennis pro. They met at the radio station during a promotional tour. The moment Joaquin saw her, he knew he had to meet her. The pair didn't have much in common, but whenever they were together, they enjoyed themselves a lot, especially indoors. Elena was athletic and extraordinarily sensual, but she possessed a superficial streak a mile wide. Sustaining a conversation with her was a drain on Joaquin's patience, and he always found himself suppressing exasperation. In short, things worked out marvelously for both of them as long as the relationship stayed between the sheets. One night she called him, terrified. She said a strange man had been harassing her, was pointing a rifle or some other kind of long-barreled weapon at her. It was Sunday, which meant Joaquin didn't have to go to work. Sunday night was one of the few times during the week he could get a good night's sleep and was, therefore, a time he relished. He didn't feel much like running off to rescue Elena or anyone else unless it was an authentic emergency. In this case, he had a hunch it was a false alarm, a panic attack brought on by Elena's vanity. Despite the fact that she appeared only occasionally, stammering through the weather reports on an afternoon news program and doing comedic banter on a morning show, she imagined she had an army of fans who devoted their days and nights to stalking her. She thought that whenever she showed up at a busy restaurant and removed the enormous sunglasses she wore in public, it was enough to make the maitre d' scurry off to prepare a special table for her. In reality, more often than not, he gave her the once-over and put her name at the end of the waiting list. This wasn't the first time Elena had called Joaquin for something like this. In fact, it was the fifth. She'd even done it a few times when he was on the air. Although the police had also responded to her calls on several occasions, they had never found the alleged stalker. He wanted to tell her to go to hell, then roll over and fall back asleep. Each time he calmed her down and got her off the phone, she'd call right back. After the fourth call, he had no choice but to go to her. He dragged himself out of bed, climbed into his car, and drove to her house. After spending several hours searching the neighborhood in vain for a threatening stranger carrying a weapon with a telescopic sight, he had nothing to show for it but a bad mood and a stiff neck. He was tired and ready to tell Elena he was sick of dealing with her neuroses. But the moment he entered her apartment, she jumped up and wrapped herself around him. Her body was warm, as if she were running a fever. Joaquin wanted to push her away, but before he could, he felt her pelvis rubbing against him. He tried to tear himself away, but he couldn't. Her sensuality overwhelmed him. He spent the rest of the night with her. It was fair compensation. He'd gotten out of bed for much less. But even though the sex was great, Joaquin told himself that he wasn't falling for the imaginary stalker story again. Around 4 a.m, he woke up thirsty. As he was going for a glass of water, he heard a strange noise. When he looked out the window, he saw a man clinging to one of the trees outside, barely concealed behind the sparse foliage, and holding some sort of recording device. "Son of a bitch! What the fuck are you doing there?" Joaquin yelled. The guy in the tree was apparently half asleep. When he heard Joaquin, he lost his balance, slipped, and was left dangling about 3 yards from the ground, his recorder hanging from one shoulder. "I'm going to kill you, you motherfucker!" Joaquin howled, running to look for his pants so he could give chase. When he came out of the house, the guy was still hanging there. Joaquin jumped up and grabbed his legs. The stranger fell on top of him. As Joaquin lay there, barefoot and dazed, the man started to run off, but Joaquin tackled him. Once he was down, he didn't put up a fight. "Don't hurt me, I only recorded the audio," he said. "You've got to be kidding. I'm going to have you arrested, you perverted bastard. You should be grateful I didn't plug you while you were in the tree, and I'm not whooping your ass right now." Out of breath, Joaquin sat down beside the man, whose recorder still hung from his shoulder. Joaquin guessed from his behavior that he wasn't the violent type. "I know this looks bad, but really it's not. I'm just collecting sounds." "Collecting sounds?" Joaquin was truly surprised. "I record people's sounds, their movements, and activities." "Secretly?" "It's got to be in secret. I want the true sounds." Of course, this immediately struck a chord with Joaquin. A great deal of what he and Gabriel had done was just that, collecting found noises, often in a clandestine way. While they dedicated most of their research to nature, insects, birds, and animals, they recorded people, machines, and street sounds as well. They had also gotten into trouble for it. They would compile and classify their finds, then polish, edit, and rework the best clips in order to sample them. Over the years, they accumulated quite an impressive collection. This sound library was a source of pride and gave a unique quality to the music they played. Joaquin couldn't maintain his fury. He was much more interested in the stalker's project than in putting him behind bars. This was too much of a coincidence. It verged on conspiracy or witchcraft. How is it possible that in Mexico City, with a population of over 20 million and thousands of criminals of all shapes and sizes, he ended up dealing with an audio fiend just like he and Gabriel had been? What were the odds of something like that? 1 in 10,000? 1 in 100,000? It was beyond improbable. He thought of all the other coincidences in his life. Sometimes he almost believed that there was a kind of unseen hand behind it all, his fate manipulated by someone or something with an unknown purpose. Joaquin wasn't religious, but he couldn't deny that often his life seemed ruled by strange laws. Order in the chaos, sense in the senselessness, destiny. Without asking permission, Joaquin grabbed his captive's backpack and started going through its contents. "Be my guest, make yourself right at home," the stalker told him. "I want to see what you've got, what your tools of the trade are." He had several recorders and microphones, one of them with the formidable telescoping boom that Elena had seen, as well as high-quality earphones and a notebook. "May I?" Joaquin asked, brandishing the notebook with a grimace. "Go right ahead." Joaquin leafed through pages of notes and comments. It was a field notebook with details of the recordings, descriptions of every situation, individual, and time of day. The notes were accompanied by diagrams of locations and various technical annotations. His handwriting was uniform, with firm, decisive strokes. Somehow this inspired trust in Joaquin, who couldn't imagine that someone who wrote so stolidly would do him any harm. "Are you aware of how risky this is?" he asked. "It's worth it." "How do you choose your subjects? How do you decide who to record?" "I observe people until I see something that resonates. It might be how they walk, eat, talk, laugh, anything. I can't explain it. I have very flexible criteria." "But you're harassing my girl, and that's got to stop." "I didn't want to bother anyone. I'm just taking her sounds. She doesn't need them, and it won't bother her if I keep them." Joaquin wanted to explain that he understood, that what he really felt like doing was asking to hear his collection. However, he remained firm. "If I hand you over to the cops, you'll probably spend the night in jail. They'll confiscate your sounds and your equipment. They might even prohibit you from going anywhere near a recorder for the rest of your life. I'll stay away from your girlfriend. I'm not interested in her, I swear. If she finds out about this, it'll be even worse for you. Up till now, she's been convinced that you're an out-of-control fan, one of her countless admirers who lose sleep over the idea of catching a glimpse of her in a camisole. And believe me, you're better off if she thinks that, because if you add a sprinkle of disappointment to this mess, she won't rest until you're punished." "I'm real sorry," the guy said. "Sorry isn't good enough. What do you use these recordings for?" "To create soundscapes." "Music?" "I wouldn't call it that. I'm interested in building landscapes using different layers of audio. I try to create minimalist, abstract textures where the protagonists weave narratives with their movements, voices, and noises." "I'm not sure I get it." "It's really basic. Think of them as movies that you can't see." "Have you done many of them?" "No, just a few. It takes months of hard work assembling sounds, finding narratives, setting up counterpoint. Anyways, it takes a long time. But I do have a couple of things ready to go." "Ready to go where?" "Anywhere someone besides me can hear them." "Let me guess. You don't have many friends, do you?" "I got some." "Sure you do," Joaquin responded with open sarcasm. "Would you be willing to show me your work?" "Of course I would." "Now?" "No, not right now." "Crafting soundscapes, can you make a living with it?" "Of course not. I've got a day job as a customer service executive with an international marketing corporation." "And what do you do there?" "Basically, I talk to potential clients on the telephone 12 hours a day from a room that holds another 39 customer service executives just like me. I call people at all hours, but the company asks us to try to do it at particularly inopportune moments. It makes it easier to sell them objects and services that they never thought they'd want or need." "Telemarketing?" "Precisely. Lady stalker, telephone predator. You wouldn't happen to be a serial killer or cannibal too, by any chance?" "Well, I haven't killed anyone, and I can't say my hunger has ever reached those extremes." "I think I see a pattern here. Your thing is to take stuff away from people who you can hear but never really see." "Yeah, I guess you're right. I never thought of it that way. But you gotta understand, my work in the marketing company isn't something I do for pleasure. It pays the bills." "Sure it does, but even so, it's probably not worth it." "You can get used to anything, even making an old lady with Parkinson's or Alzheimer's invest her life savings and shares of a pharmaceutical company the night before it tanks." "You used to do that?" "I didn't say that." "So you didn't?" "I never said that either." "You're a professional crook." "Everything I do is legal. Not especially ethical or nice, but legal. That is to say, strictly speaking, I don't break the law. I just create the conditions necessary for my bosses to abuse the trust of naive and defenseless people." "Disgusting." "Forget all that and come work for me." "How? You want me to steal for you?" "I need a sound engineer for my program." "Program?" Joaquin told him about Ghost Radio. He listened with interest. "I've never done radio." "Even better. We can start from scratch." "But what about jail and your girlfriend?" "Never mind that. Quit working for those con men, come with me, and all is forgiven. Although I am going to have to think up a good excuse for Elena. Tell her I got away. Or that I killed you, cut you into little pieces, and threw you into the sewer. That would get me more hours of grateful sex." "Whatever." "Nope, I'm going to have to tell her the truth, which means I'll probably be left without a girlfriend. So I hope what I'm doing for you is worth it. Here." Joaquin gave him one of the business cards the station had had printed up for him. "Show up on Monday at 8 p.m. We'll talk then. You know, if you want some memories of her, I have a bunch here. Don't test my tolerance. Thanks. So, you're really offering me a job? Yep. What's your name? Mine's Joaquin. He offered him his hand to seal the deal. People call me Watt. Chapter 37. Call 1904, Monday, 4:01 a.m. The translator. This story is about me, said the caller. But even more, it's about a man who was my friend for many years, Norbert Gutterman. This happened a long time ago when I worked in downtown New York. This would be around 10 years ago now, and at the time I was still trying to make it in middle management at Emigrant Savings Bank. We usually worked from 8 to 5, but I would stay longer on most days, trying to impress my bosses, you know. I rode a packed train at 7 in the morning and came home on a nearly empty one at 8 or 9 in the evening. I rarely had free time, and when I did, I usually spent it at bars or at home watching soccer games on Telemundo. One Sunday morning, on a whim, I decided to head into Central Park. I'm not sure why. Fresh air, maybe. I was carrying the newspaper under my arm. I figured I might find a nice spot in the sun and read the financial section. As I made my way down one of the paths, I noticed a man sitting by himself at one of those outdoor chess tables, kind of isolated in a small plaza under a couple of oak trees. He was thin, older, wearing a brown suit that was threadbare but clean, and he held an old-fashioned briefcase on his lap. Even though he was outdoors, he conjured up images of thick leather-bound books and wood paneling. You might even say that with the crisp creases in his trousers and the defined shadows and lines in his face, he resembled a well-preserved antique book himself. He looked up as I passed and waved me over, which surprised me. I hadn't found people to be that friendly in the city, and except for the women professionals I occasionally dated, I tended to avoid contact outside of work. I wondered if maybe he was looking to hustle me. Something about him, his posture, or his hair that curled a little at the neck, or his shoes, reminded me of premature unemployment, living alone, and for a reason I can't explain, of pickles and onions floating in a jar. I needn't have worried. He looked down at the chessboard in front of him, the pieces all laid out and ready, and asked, "Care for a game?" I almost shook my head and walked away, but something made me stay. Pity, or curiosity, maybe. So we played chess. He tested my game, let me joust a couple of moves, and then beat me with a simple queen pin. He told me his name was Norbert. He was a Polish immigrant, a translator by trade, specializing in Eastern European poetry and history. I asked him if he'd done anything I might have read. "From the look of you, I doubt it," he said. It was embarrassing, but true. I hadn't read a good book since college, and as for poetry, well, I didn't think nursery rhymes counted. It was actually fun, but at last I excused myself. One of those chance encounters, I figured. A story that would be remembered for a few weeks or months, and then forgotten. As I walked away, Norbert called after me. "Next week, then." I laughed and waved patronizingly. The following weekend, I was busy on a conference call most of the day. Afterward, I was exhausted, drank a six-pack watching football, and went to bed. But I couldn't stop thinking about that chess game. Half in, half out of the shade, my opponent considering his moves carefully, the way I imagined he picked words out of the back of his mind before he laid them down on the page. The next week I went back. Norbert was there, reading. He didn't mention our missed appointment, and after that I went to the park every Sunday. Sometimes I would even beg out of weekend meetings or put off projects until Monday. That weekly game was like a tropical island in a sea of work. It was my one genuine human contact, a time when I could sit in the quiet of the park, reveling in the shouts of children, the sprinkle of fountains in the distance, and just live and breathe and think. It was a friendship with no strings attached. It seemed like Norbert didn't do much work anymore, but every week he'd be sitting there, with a book in a different language or maybe a sandwich, always on rye bread with raw onions. We'd talk about poetry and history. He'd tell me stories of his childhood in Poland, and we'd admire the women that jogged or walked past us. Norbert, you see, was a great lover of women. He had so many different anecdotes that I often accused him of fabrication. Inside, though, I didn't doubt him. After we got to know each other better, I occasionally invited him to join me outside of the park, for dinner, for coffee, for a local poetry reading or play. He always said he was busy, although it was obvious he was being evasive. I figured that maybe there was a part of his life that he wanted to keep private, whether it was a dingy apartment, a wife, maybe he lived in a rest home, or maybe he didn't even have a home. I didn't have his phone number or address. We only met in the park at that table. Now and then we took a turn around the pond to watch the fish rise to catch flies as dusk moved in. Eventually, I quit my job. I think my meetings with Norbert had a lot to do with it. I started to dread going to the office. I lived for those days in the park. I'd applied to graduate school, and a place in Baltimore accepted me into a writing program. The weekend before I was to move, I sat down at the chess table and told Norbert that this would be the last time I'd see him. He took the news quietly. We played chess in silence and sat for some time until I had to go. I looked back at him as I walked away. He was sitting with his hands in his lap, looking after me, wistful, as firmly planted as the oak that hung over him like an awning. It was in my second year of school that I found myself searching the aisles of a used bookstore. I needed an obscure text for an independent study project, and I hadn't been able to find it in the school library. As I was browsing, I came across a small, yellowed book, the kind that they used to print in the 70s. The cover read, "The Minsk Publishers," in 1952, in black on white. This volume didn't fit in with the cloth and leather-bound hard covers next to it, and I flipped through the first few pages. The author was Ignacy Chotsko, an unfamiliar name, but underneath were words that caught my eye. Translated from the Polish by Norbert Gutterman. I was thrilled. It felt like I had been looking through a keyhole for years, and the door had suddenly been thrown wide in front of me. I leafed through the book that night. It was an odd history of Poland, but I could hear Norbert's voice in its words, the careful pacing that imbued everything he did. It felt like a window into his mind, a validation that he had a rich, vibrant history of which I was only the latest chapter. In the back, I noted with some excitement, was a page titled, "About the Translator." A moment later, the book fell from my fingers and landed pages spread face down on the floor. I picked it up again, my hand shaking a little, and reread the first few sentences. Norbert Gutterman, 1901 to 1984, was one of the most prominent translators of the 20th century. Born in Poland, he lived in countries all around the world, making his home in New York for many years. He moved to Cuernavaca, Mexico in the 1980s, where in June 1984 he passed away of natural causes. That was 10 years ago. Since then, my experiences with Norbert are never far from my mind. At worst, I thought I'd gone crazy. In my better times, I think fondly about the man I'd met and wonder who he really was. Well, I moved back to New York 2 years ago. What can I say? I just couldn't stay away. My first weekend back in town, I hurried out to the park. I had to know whether my Sundays in the city had been a dream. I returned to our table often and just read books and wait. I have started many games waiting for him. Sometimes I catch the faint odor of pickles and onions and think he has come to play chess. Chapter 38. The Call. At 8 in the morning, which by Joaquin's schedule was midnight, the telephone rang. "Yes," Joaquin roared with what little energy he could muster. "Hi, I want to share a story with you," the voice said, imitating the style of ghost radio. "What?" "A story. I've got a story for you." "Wrong number," he said. He moved to hang up, but his arm stopped when he realized he recognized the voice. "No, Joaquin, I've got the right number. I want to talk to you, and I prefer to do it in the intimacy of your home, but we can continue to follow the program's format. Would that make it be more comfortable for you?" "Who is this?" "Someone who wants to share a story with you." "Look, I don't know how you got this number, but this isn't the right time or the right person. Have a nice day." Joaquin slammed down the telephone. He felt sure that hanging up that way would solve things. He couldn't get back to sleep. Alondra raised her head. "Don't tell me that's what I think it was. Someone found our number and wants to give us a little home delivery?" "It looks that way. Let's hope he doesn't keep calling back. Let's hope, she said, her head dropping back down onto the pillow. The room was almost pitch black thanks to the heavy curtains they had installed so they could sleep late. Joaquin stumbled away from the bed, smacking his knee on the way. His hands felt puffy, his face like a giant scab ready to fall off, and an acrid, acid taste filled his mouth. He entered the bathroom, flipped on the light, and looked at his face in the mirror. It didn't look like a giant scab, but 2-day beard, baggy eyes, death-white lips, and tightened skin made him look about 15 years older. Not much of an improvement. At least 15, maybe more, he said out loud. Quietly, he left the bathroom and stumbled into the kitchen. He fired up his latest toy, the Seiko Primea Touch Plus, a gift from the station. While the espresso dripped into the cup, the telephone rang again. This time, Joaquin checked the caller ID. J. Cortez, followed by a number that meant nothing to him. He quietly thanked technology for making it possible to catch red-handed all the imbeciles who harassed people from behind the anonymity of their receivers. Imbeciles too stupid to know that any phone could block caller ID. I believe in the microchip, he said to himself as he picked up the receiver, and you are now officially fucked. Yes, Joaquin, it seems we were cut off. Yes, we were, because I hung up the telephone. Look, Mr. He glanced at the display again. J. Cortez, I don't know you. I don't feel like talking to you, especially at this time of day. I just want to tell you a story. Can't you understand that this is neither the time nor place? Be so kind as to never call here again. A friend of mine had a terrible accident when he was a teenager. His life was left in tatters. It seemed like the end, like they'd seal him up in a wooden casket and bury him next to the rest of the victims. Instead, he recovered and life went on. Years later, he had another close call and was left pulverized, burned to ashes. But just when everyone again thought they'd be sweeping him into a little box and putting him away with all the other relics, he got back on his feet and kept going. They thought this guy was either very lucky or had a guardian angel, but actually he had a secret. He was a vampire who sapped the life energy from others, a parasite who could survive anything by stealing the inner flame of those around him. Joaquin listened, disconcerted, furious, and afraid, all at the same time. Was this nonsense? A biting accusation, or the truth about his life? All right, you've told your story. Now what do you want? Not my story. Yours. I don't like people invading my privacy. Thousands of listeners knew that Joaquin had survived the automobile accident in which his parents had died, and those who dug a bit could easily find out about the events surrounding Gabriel's death. What do you want? Joaquin asked again. Then he heard a click as the caller hung up. Joaquin tossed the cordless handset onto the counter. Fuck you very much, he said under his breath. The perfect espresso he had prepared for himself was cold. He hated cold coffee. He watched its thick layer of crema, not too light, not too dark, dissolve. The coffee was dying. He took a sip of it anyway, as he analyzed what had just occurred. But his thoughts were muddled. Too many strange things had been happening to him. None made sense. He'd never received a call like this one, and no matter how enraging it was, all he felt was a big hole in his chest. Alondra came out of the bedroom. She held on to the doorframe as if the building were shaking. Was that the same idiot? She said, shading her eyes, which carried traces of mascara. Joaquin nodded. She walked into the kitchen, pulling down her t-shirt until it covered her belly button. Your coffee. What? Joaquin shook his head. Your coffee, it's cold. Yep. He raised the cup and drank it in one swallow. The whole time they'd lived together, Alondra had never seen Joaquin drink a cold espresso. This time he didn't even blink. Then he took a pen and wrote down the number next to J. Cortez on the caller ID. What are you going to do? Look for the guy. Alondra shook her head. Alondra, I have to do this. Alondra said nothing. She sat down beside him and waited. He stared at the piece of paper as if it were a code he could crack or one of those Where's Waldo pages. Are you going to make me a coffee, or will I be forced to go to Starbucks? She said. Joaquin leaped to his feet and prepared her an espresso with impeccable crema, worthy of a commercial with a living room bathed in morning light. His mind was elsewhere, not distracted or absent-minded from drowsiness, truly elsewhere. Alondra's warm and sensual body and the intimacy of their home looked unreal to Joaquin, as unreal as the set for that imaginary coffee commercial. He felt cut off from this modest paradise, expelled by Jay Cortez. Somehow that man's words had penetrated his hard shell, the shell that protected him during his communion with the dead. The call crushed all this with a single devastating blow. When she'd finished her coffee, Alondra stood up. "I'm going to take a shower. Want to join me? It'd do you good. It might even wash away those bags under your eyes." Joaquin hesitated, but he really couldn't waste any more time. He needed to go. "No, you go ahead. I've got something to do." He dialed the number. Let the hunt begin. The telephone rang around 9 times before a harsh voice with a strong Spanish accent answered. "Hello? Who's speaking?" "Pastor Cuauhtémoc y Lumicamina, at your service." "Pastor, what's it? What did you say your name was?" The voice on the telephone patiently repeated itself. "I believe you called me a moment ago," Joaquin said, although he knew it wasn't the same voice. "And you are? Answer me this. Didn't you just call me to tell me a story?" "I haven't a clue what you're talking about." "I've got your number on my caller ID. Jay Cortez, that's you, right?" "I already told you. I'm Pastor Cuauhtémoc y Lumicamina of the Temple of Christian and Toltec Redemption." "Of what redemption?" The pastor repeated himself again. "Well, you won't find redemption by making crank calls." "I didn't call you. I don't even know who you are." "Then someone used your phone to call me. Who was it?" "No one has used his telephone." Joaquin didn't want to argue. He had proof the call came from this number. He'd go there and show Jay Cortez the proof. With a little luck, showing up in person would end the harassment. He'd confront the pastor and warn him not to mess with him anymore. Armed with both the name and telephone number, he easily found the address for the Temple of Christian and Toltec Redemption with a couple of quick Google searches. It was just an apartment located in one of the slums at the edge of town. He dressed quickly, not waiting for Alondra to finish her shower, and in 5 minutes he was in his car, driving toward a rendezvous with Pastor y Lumicamina. The building was in an enormous block of housing projects. Joaquin went up to the 7th floor in an elevator covered with graffiti and looked down a dark hallway for number 713. The apartment's front door was ajar, and he heard voices coming from inside. As he approached, a small boy, maybe 8 or 9, peeked out. Behind him, Joaquin saw 2 overweight women sitting at their kitchen table listening to the radio. Joaquin smiled at the boy, but as he got closer, the boy slammed the door. It was strange. Joaquin felt sure that he had heard Watt's voice in the apartment, although there was no ghost radio broadcast at that time of day. He shrugged. He had bigger concerns at the moment. He knocked firmly on the door to the improvised temple. A short, portly man wrapped in an old bathrobe, who looked about 55, opened the door. "Can I help you?" he said with the tone of a decadent mariachi. "I'm the guy who called a while ago." "Uh-huh," the man said, skeptically. "I want to solve the mystery of the calls I received. I say mystery because according to my caller ID, they came from your telephone, and since you say you didn't make them, I'm going to help you find out who did. It's for the good of both of us. But no one here is going around making obscene phone calls to people." "Let's talk," Joaquin said, brusquely entering the temple apartment without asking permission. Caught off guard, the man let him pass. Inside was a small one-room apartment. Dusty furniture sat in odd places, and covering all available surfaces was a strange array of objects. Porcelain figurines, quick-clean bottles filled with suspect liquids, dollhouses, plastic soldiers, blank paper, unsharpened pencils, myriad flashlights, old religious magazines from past decades, a partially disassembled radio, fruit, crucifixes, dried tortillas. As Joaquin took in the chaos, he thought to himself, what a pathetic and embarrassing place. Who could live here? However, he quickly realized that the paraphernalia and arrangement of the furniture followed a specific pattern. There was logic in the chaos. The bric-a-brac had been organized with maniacal, childlike precision, with the delirious fervor of one who supposes that objects have secret powers if you combine them correctly. And something else about it grabbed his attention. It reminded him of something he could not name. "My friend, you have arrived at a bad time. As you can see, I was about to have a bath and then give a service. This won't take much of your time. May I sit?" The call had put Joaquin into an implacable mood. He had never behaved like this with a stranger, much less a man of the cloth, even if, in this case, that cloth was Toltec Christian. "I've no idea who might have called you," said the pastor. "Try to think. If I can't figure this out, I'm going to have to go to the police," Joaquin replied, picking up a disgusting headdress covered with ketchup stains. Ketchup stains. Or blood. "Might have been the boy. I don't think so. Doesn't do such things." "Boy?" "One of the members of my congregation. Sometimes lends a hand with administrative matters." "There. We already have a clue. What's this boy's name, and where can I find him?" "Barry. He'll be here soon." "How soon? Maybe we should go get him," Joaquin said, continuing to pick up and fidget with the items on the table, chairs, and floor. Even as he kept touching them, he felt certain that he should leave them alone, not just because his hands were getting dirty, but because by intervening in the order-disorder that presided over them, Joaquin thought he might unleash something he couldn't fully comprehend. Something evil. Why would he have such a thought? It seemed crazy. Joaquin wasn't prone to credulousness or fear of charlatans, but as he spoke to this pastor, he got the distinct impression that very strange things could happen in this place. "I have no idea where he might be." "Well, we're going to have to find him." At this point, the preacher's tone of voice changed. He took on a mournful expression and said, "You've come to kill me. I've seen this in my visions." Then his eyes rolled up in his head and he recited what sounded like a prayer. "I didn't come here to kill anyone. I just want to be left alone." The man raised his head and continued his strange prayer, incantation, or whatever it was. "Xolotl, Xelatil, Dominim, Budadil." "Enough already. I haven't come here to hurt anyone." The man ignored Joaquin, raising his voice and repeating a mantra of strange words that sounded vaguely familiar. Joaquin went over to him. When he was only a step away, the preacher sprang up onto his toes and punched him in the face. Joaquin moved, but not quickly enough. The man's fist glanced off his cheekbone with enough force to knock him off balance. He fell back, slamming hard into a drawer filled with broken toys, and pain shot through his spine. As he stood up, the preacher kicked him, first in the ribs, then in the gut. This guy's done this before, Joaquin thought as he curled away from another blow. Then age and weight caught up with the pastor. He stopped kicking and took a short, wheezing breath. This might be Joaquin's only chance. He leaped to his feet and charged, throwing his right shoulder into the pastor's abdomen. The pastor hardly budged, raining a series of blows on Joaquin, mostly to the gut and kidneys. Joaquin reeled. Where the fuck did this guy learn to fight, he thought? And why is he fighting with me? These thoughts running through his mind, Joaquin dodged and blocked the blows, looking for a way in. A knee to the balls, a forearm to the throat, something to stop the pastor in his tracks. Finally, he found it. Ducking under a hail of fists, Joaquin grabbed the pastor around the waist, tightening his grip. Not what he hoped for, but it did the job. The pastor wriggled and twisted, trying to break free. No luck. Joaquin held tight, increasing his vice-like hold. The smell of the pastor's cheap soap and aftershave wafted into Joaquin's nose, and he wondered how he'd gotten himself into this situation. A mysterious phone call, and less than an hour later he's wrestling with a reverend of Toltec Christianity. Life takes some odd turns. At that thought, the pastor broke free, pushing himself away from Joaquin, clasping his hands together and bringing them down hard on the top of Joaquin's head. Joaquin reeled, watching the floor wobble and turn to jello. It looked so inviting, soft, gentle, and welcoming. He wanted to collapse into it. The door swung open. Joaquin righted himself and glanced toward the door. His blurry vision could just make out a rough shape. "Maestro, I couldn't find—" The pastor turned toward the voice, and Joaquin sent a right cross speeding toward his jaw, hoping his hazy vision could be trusted. A sharp crack and a thud as the pastor's body hit the floor told him it could. "What the fuck?" exclaimed the blur at the door. Joaquin glanced toward the blur, shaking his head. The shape resolved itself into a blond boy holding packages. Just as the image became clear, the boy dropped the packages and ran off. "Get back here!" yelled Joaquin. Pulled by strings that seemed beyond his control, he went after the young man. He remembered what the pastor had called him. "Barry, hold up. I just want to ask you something." But the young man kept on running. He took the stairs, jumping down, sliding, and bouncing hard off the walls. Joaquin followed him at top speed, losing contact with the ground, stumbling and leaping as he went. On the ground floor, he almost caught up with the young man in the foyer, but Barry made it into the street, expanding his lead. Joaquin wasn't thinking, he was only running, possessed by a force he'd never felt before. His feet seemed to float above the sidewalk. He dodged people as if they were moving in slow motion. The fresh air and intensity of the pursuit cleared his head. It filled him with energy. It felt almost as if he were playing tag with Barry, whom he knew he'd reach any moment now. Meanwhile, Barry kept bumping into pedestrians, struggling to give Joaquin the slip, until finally on one corner he tripped, lost his balance, and fell to the ground. Joaquin came to a stop over him and stuck out his arm to help him up, but with enough force so he'd understand that there was no escape. Barry's knee was bleeding. When he saw Joaquin leaning over him, he covered his face. "I just want to ask you a few questions," Joaquin said, out of breath from the chase.